Montana Territory, 1887. The winter winds howled across the open prairie like a woman scorned, clawing at the weathered walls of the lone cabin nestled in the foothills of the Bitterroot Mountains. Inside, Hank Barstow sat alone at his rough-hewn table, watching flames dance in the stone hearth, a cup of coffee grown cold between his calloused hands. At 26, his shoulders already carried the weight of a man twice his age, though his face remained unmarked by the deep lines that characterized most men who'd spent years beneath the merciless western sun. The lamplight caught the golden highlights in his wheat-colored hair, falling just above piercing blue eyes that had seen too much death for someone so young. Despite his solitude, Hank maintained a certain pride in his appearance. His stubble never grew past 3 days' worth, and his clothes, though worn, were kept clean and mended. It wasn't vanity but discipline, a remnant from his father's military bearing that had been drilled into him before the man was cut down by Comanche raiders when Hank was just 14. "Another winter," he muttered to the empty room, his breath visible even indoors. The isolation suited him, or so he told himself. Ever since he'd staked his claim on this stretch of Montana wilderness 5 years ago, he'd made it clear to everyone in Whiteridge County that Hank Barstow wasn't looking for companionship, especially not the kind that came with a wedding band. The frontier was no place for love. That truth had been carved into his soul the day he'd watched his mother wither away from grief after his father's death, leaving him alone to navigate the brutal realities of the West. Love made you vulnerable, it made you weak. And weakness got you killed out here where the only law was what a man could enforce with his own 2 hands and the rifle propped by his door. Hank rose from his chair and moved to add another log to the fire. The bitter cold reminded him that his stores were running low. Tomorrow, he'd need to make the half-day ride into town for supplies, a trip he'd been putting off as long as possible. Whiteridge had grown significantly in the 3 months since his last visit, the railroad's recent arrival bringing a steady stream of settlers, merchants, and worst of all, eligible young women. The last time he'd gone for supplies, Mrs. Holloway from the general store had tried to introduce him to her niece freshly arrived from Boston. Before that, it had been the widow Jenkins with her apple pies and batted eyelashes. And before her, the banker's daughter with her fine education and piano-playing fingers that had never known a day of hard work. Every unmarried woman in Whiteridge County seemed determined to end Hank Barstow's solitude, and every one of them failed to understand that he preferred it that way. What he needed was clear: his land, his cattle, and the freedom to build his ranch without the complications that came with sharing his life. What he wanted was to be left alone. As he settled back into his chair, Hank's gaze drifted to the small shelf where he kept his few personal possessions: a battered copy of the Iliad, his father's pocket watch, and a daguerreotype of his parents on their wedding day. His mother's smile haunted him, so full of hope before the frontier crushed it out of her. "No," he said firmly to the empty room, "not for me." Outside, the wind screamed its lonely reply. The next morning dawned clear and frigid. Frost coated the windows of Hank's cabin in delicate patterns that reminded him of the lace doilies his mother had once cherished. He saddled his stallion, Thunderhead, and set out for town before the sun had fully cleared the eastern mountains. The ride to Whiteridge gave him too much time to think. He passed the Sorensen place, where 3 daughters had been married off in succession over the past 2 years, each wedding drawing pitying looks his way. Then came the Douglas homestead, where the eldest daughter had made it painfully obvious during last summer's community barn raising that she found Hank's strong shoulders and quiet demeanor appealing. Hank urged Thunderhead faster, hoping to outrun the memories of awkward conversations and thinly veiled matchmaking attempts. He had refused them all politely at first, then with increasing bluntness as the ladies of Whiteridge County refused to take the hint. By midday, the collection of wooden structures that comprised Whiteridge came into view. What had been little more than a trading post and saloon when Hank first arrived was now a proper town, complete with a church, school, and the newly constructed train station that had transformed the once remote settlement into a growing hub of activity. Hank tied Thunderhead to the hitching post outside Holloway's general store, steeling himself for the inevitable. The bell above the door announced his arrival, and Mrs. Holloway's round face immediately brightened with recognition. "Hank Barstow," she exclaimed, wiping her hands on her apron. "Why, we'd started to wonder if you'd frozen solid up in those hills. It's been near 3 months since you've graced us with your presence." "Been busy with the herd," he replied, removing his hat. "Need supplies for the rest of winter." Of course," Mrs. Holloway nodded, already beginning to gather items. "We've got a fresh shipment of coffee beans just arrived by train." "Imagine that, coffee from Brazil right here in Whiteridge," the railroads changing everything. Hank nodded noncommittally, scanning his mental list. 20 pounds of flour, 10 of sugar, coffee, salt pork, beans, ammunition for a Winchester. Writing it all down, Mrs. Holloway assured him. You know, Hank, the Westover family moved into the old Miller place last month. They've got a daughter about your age. Sweet girl, handy with a needle, makes the most beautiful quilts you've ever seen. Hank's jaw tightened. Just the supplies, Mrs. Holloway. She sighed dramatically. You can't blame a body for trying. It isn't natural, a handsome young man like yourself living all alone up there. What happens if you take sick or break a leg? Who's to care for you then? I manage, he said flatly. Well, that may be, but... The bell above the door chimed again, saving Hank from further matchmaking efforts. He turned slightly, expecting another town resident, only to find himself face to face with a young woman he'd never seen before. She stepped into the warm store, unwinding a woolen scarf from around her neck to reveal a heart-shaped face framed by hair the color of chestnuts in autumn, rich brown with hints of gold where the sunlight touched it. Her eyes, a clear green like spring grass, assessed the store's interior before settling on Hank with undisguised curiosity. Good afternoon, she said, her voice carrying a slight Eastern accent. She was dressed practically in a dark blue woolen dress with a simple coat, nothing like the frilly fashions the local girls favored when coming to town. Something about her stance, confident, self-contained, gave Hank pause. Tessa. Perfect timing, Mrs. Holloway beamed. Hank, this is Tessa Prescott. She's been helping Doc Simmons since she arrived last month. Tessa, meet Hank Barstow. He owns the cattle ranch up in the North Valley. Tessa Prescott nodded politely. Mr. Barstow, I've heard your name mentioned. A slight smile played at the corners of her lips, suggesting she'd heard more than just his name. Miss Prescott, Hank returned stiffly, replacing his hat. Mrs. Holloway, I'll be at the mercantile for ammunition. Have my order ready in an hour. Without waiting for a response, Hank strode from the store, the bell jangling his exit. Behind him, he heard Mrs. Holloway's apologetic tones. Don't mind him, dear. Hank's always been a bit solitary. Ever since he came to these parts. Outside in the biting cold, Hank drew a deep breath. Something about those green eyes had unnerved him. They'd looked at him with neither the desperate hope of the local girls nor the prying concern of the town matrons. Instead, they'd seemed to see right through him, as if all his carefully constructed walls were made of nothing more substantial than morning mist. He shook off the feeling and headed toward the mercantile. One more woman in Whiteridge made no difference to him. His life was set, and no amount of green-eyed scrutiny would change that. An hour later, with Thunderhead loaded with supplies, Hank was more than ready to leave town. He'd nearly escaped when Sheriff Taylor waved him down from the steps of the jailhouse. Hank, hold up there, son. Reluctantly, Hank reined in. Sheriff. The older man approached, his weathered face creased with concern beneath his gray mustache. Glad I caught you. We've had reports of wolves getting bold up your way. Killed 3 of Peterson's sheep last week, and Johnson lost a calf 2 nights back. Haven't seen any around my place, Hank replied. Well, keep your rifle handy. This cold's driving them down from the high country earlier than usual. Sheriff Taylor glanced at Hank's loaded horse. Stocking up for a long winter, I see. Plan to make it my last trip till spring. The sheriff shook his head. That's a long stretch of solitude, even for you. You ever think about taking on a ranch hand, or maybe finding yourself a... No, Hank cut him off firmly. Sheriff Taylor raised his hands in surrender. All right, all right. Can't blame a man for worrying about a neighbor. He lowered his voice. But speaking of neighbors, there's something else you should know. Had a stranger asking questions about ranch properties yesterday. Well-dressed fellow, Eastern accent, said he represents some cattle company out of Chicago. Hank frowned. What kind of questions? Water rights mostly, size of herds. Who owns what parcel? The sheriff scratched his chin. I don't like it. These big outfits have been buying up small ranches all across Wyoming and Montana. Sometimes the owners sell willingly. Sometimes there's pressure. Nobody pressures me off my land, Hank stated, his hand instinctively moving to rest on his holstered revolver. I know that, son, just wanted to give you fair warning. Sheriff Taylor glanced down the street. Oh, and there's one more thing, Doc's new assistant. I met her, Hank interrupted, eager to end the conversation. Then you know she's looking for a place outside town. Doc's rooms are too small for the both of them, especially with patients sometimes staying overnight. The sheriff gave Hank a meaningful look. Your old line cabin's still standing, isn't it? The one by the creek. Hank stared at him in disbelief. You're not suggesting. It's going to waste, and it's close enough to town that she could ride in when Doc needs her. Before Hank could protest, the sheriff continued, she's not some helpless city girl, Hank. Trained as a nurse during the war, knows her way around firearms too, saw her shoot the head off a rattler that got into Doc's garden. Clean shot at 20 paces. The answer is no, Hank said flatly. I don't need neighbors. Sheriff Taylor sighed. Well, think about it. Might not be bad having someone with medical knowledge close by, especially with wolves and mysterious cattle companies about. He tipped his hat. Safe ride home, Hank. Hank mounted Thunderhead without another word, his mood darker than the storm clouds gathering on the western horizon. The idea of anyone, especially a woman, living on his land was absurd. The line cabin was dilapidated at best, and he had no desire to play landlord. As he urged his horse past the doctor's office, the door opened and Tessa Prescott stepped out. Their eyes met briefly across the muddy street. She offered a small nod, which Hank returned stiffly before spurring Thunderhead toward the trail home. The storm caught him halfway back to his ranch, a sudden squall that sent ice crystals stinging against his face. By the time he reached his cabin, darkness had fallen, and his fingers were numb despite his heavy gloves. He unsaddled Thunderhead and made sure the horse was comfortable in the small but sturdy stable before hauling his supplies inside. The cabin was cold, the fire having died hours before. Hank worked mechanically, building a new fire, putting away supplies, preparing a simple meal. But as he sat alone at his table once more, he found his thoughts drifting to the stranger in town and the cattle company she represented. His father had taught him that land was the only thing worth having in this world. It couldn't be stolen like money or killed like people. Hank had built his small herd from nothing, working himself to exhaustion year after year. The idea that someone might try to take it from him kindled a slow-burning anger. And beneath that anger, though he would never admit it, flickered something else, a moment of hesitation when the sheriff had mentioned the line cabin. For a fraction of a second an image had formed, smoke rising from the cabin chimney, a light in the window, someone to talk to during the endless winter nights. Hank banished the thought immediately. Foolishness, he muttered to the empty room and turned his attention to cleaning his rifle. If trouble was coming, he would face it as he faced everything else, alone. 2 weeks passed, and Hank put the town and its people from his mind. He focused on his cattle, riding out daily to check on the herd despite the bitter cold. The wolves the sheriff had warned about made an appearance 3 nights after his trip to town, their howls echoing across the valley. Hank had fired warning shots into the air, but he knew they would return. Hungry predators always did. He was repairing a broken fence line when he heard hoofbeats approaching. His hand moved instinctively to his revolver as he straightened, squinting against the bright winter sunlight reflecting off the snow. 2 riders were making their way up the trail to his property, one the unmistakable figure of Sheriff Taylor, the other smaller and riding with a straight-backed grace that Hank recognized even at a distance. Damn it all, he muttered, driving the last fence stake into the frozen ground with more force than necessary. He'd made his position clear. What part of no had the sheriff failed to understand? As they drew closer, Hank crossed his arms and waited, his expression set in stern lines. Afternoon, Hank, Sheriff Taylor called as they reined in. Beautiful day, ain't it? What brings you out here, Sheriff? Hank replied, deliberately ignoring the woman beside him. Well, now I'm glad you asked. The sheriff dismounted with a groan, his joints protesting the cold. Got word this morning that the Peterson place was hit last night. Not wolves this time. 2 men rode in, shot his dog, and told him he had a week to decide whether to sell or have his place burned down around him. This news momentarily distracted Hank from his irritation. Peterson all right. Shaken up but not hurt, his boy was quick enough to grab a shotgun, which convinced the visitors to state their business and leave. Sheriff Taylor glanced at Tessa, who remained mounted, her green eyes taking in Hank's homestead with keen interest. Miss Prescott here was tending to Peterson's dog when he told us what happened. Thought you ought to know, seeing as your place is isolated. Hank's jaw tightened. I appreciate the warning, but you could have sent anyone with that message. That's where you're wrong, the sheriff replied evenly. Miss Prescott has business of her own to discuss with you, and before you get your back up, I'd advise you to listen. I'm riding on to alert the Johnsons and Wilcoxes. He turned to Tessa. I'll be back this way in about 3 hours, that enough time? More than sufficient, thank you, she answered, her voice calm and measured. The sheriff mounted again with another groan. Hank, try not to be more stubborn than that mule of yours." With that parting shot, he wheeled his horse and rode off, leaving Hank alone with his unwanted visitor. For a long moment neither spoke. Finally, Hank broke the silence. "Whatever Mrs. Holloway or the sheriff told you, Miss Prescott, I'm not in the market for a wife, a housekeeper, or a tenant." To his surprise, she laughed, a genuine sound of amusement that transformed her serious face. "Is that what you think this is? Another matchmaking attempt?" She dismounted smoothly, her boots crunching in the snow. "Mr. Barstow, I assure you, I have no more interest in acquiring a husband than you do a wife." Something in her direct manner caught him off guard. Up close, he could see she was younger than he'd first thought, perhaps 20 or 22, but there was a self-possession about her that spoke of experiences beyond her years. Her chestnut hair was pulled back in a practical knot beneath her hat, and her clothes, while feminine, were chosen for function rather than fashion. "Then why are you here?" he asked bluntly. "Because I need somewhere to live that isn't the back room of a doctor's office, and you have an empty cabin that's going to waste." She gestured toward the line cabin visible through the trees near the creek. "Sheriff Taylor mentioned it's habitable with some repairs." "Habitable is generous," Hank countered. "Roof leaks, chimney needs work, not fit for a woman alone." "I've lived in worse," she replied simply. "During the war, I spent 2 years in field hospitals where the roof was canvas and the walls were whatever we could find. I can manage repairs myself if you're concerned about the imposition." Hank studied her with narrowed eyes. "Why not stay in town? Plenty of boarding houses since the railroad came." "Because I need space, Mr. Barstow." For the first time, a hint of vulnerability showed in her composed features. "I came west to practice medicine without the constraints placed on women in the East. In town, I'm under constant observation, every action scrutinized, every decision questioned. I need somewhere I can study, experiment with medicines, and occasionally escape the endless parade of people who think a woman should be married by 20. Despite himself, Hank felt a flicker of understanding. Wasn't that precisely why he'd chosen this isolated valley, to escape others' expectations? Besides, she continued pragmatically, with these cattle company men causing trouble, having someone at the line cabin means an extra set of eyes watching your property. I'm a light sleeper and, as the sheriff may have mentioned, a decent shot." Hank uncrossed his arms, caught between his ingrained wariness and a reluctant appreciation for her straightforward approach. "What's in it for me?" he asked finally. "Besides another person to worry about when wolves come around. Medical care when needed. I've noticed the scar on your right hand, poorly stitched by someone without training. And the way you favor your left shoulder suggests an old injury that never healed properly." Her gaze was clinical but not unkind. "I can help with such things, and I'm willing to pay rent in currency or services." Hank unconsciously flexed his right hand, the scar from a run-in with barbed wire still tight across his palm. "I manage fine on my own." "Of course you do," she agreed, surprising him again. "Just as I would manage fine staying in town, but neither situation is ideal, is it?" Her honesty was disarming. Unlike the local girls with their fluttering eyelashes and transparent attempts to draw him into conversation, Tessa Prescott spoke to him as one adult to another. It was refreshing. "Cabin needs more work than you realize," he said, his tone less hostile. "Roof won't last another heavy snow, stoves rusted through." "Then name your price for the materials and I'll handle the rest." She took a step closer, her breath clouding in the cold air. "Mr. Barstow, I'm not asking to intrude on your solitude. All I want is a quiet place where I can do my work without the entire town watching and whispering. The cabin is far enough from your house that we needn't see each other for weeks at a time, if that's your preference." Hank found himself considering it, despite his better judgment. The cabin had stood empty for 3 years since the old ranch hand who'd lived there had moved on to Oregon. It was going to ruin anyway. "Let me think on it," he said finally. "You can tell the sheriff your piece when he returns." She nodded, accepting his non-answer with grace. "Fair enough. May I water my horse while we wait?" He gestured toward the stable, pumps inside. "Out of the wind." As she led her horse away, Hank turned back to his fence repair, his thoughts in turmoil. Every instinct warned him against allowing anyone onto his land, disrupting the careful isolation he'd built. And yet. He glanced toward the line cabin, its weathered logs barely visible through the pines. It would take considerable work to make it habitable before the worst of winter set in. But if she truly meant what she said about respecting his privacy, Hank drove another stake into the ground, trying to ignore the small voice in the back of his mind that whispered how pleasant it might be to have another human being within shouting distance when the winter nights grew long and dark. When Sheriff Taylor returned, Hank had made his decision. He would allow Tessa Prescott to rent the line cabin under strict conditions. She would be responsible for all repairs, would not interfere with his ranch operations, and would understand that this arrangement did not constitute a social relationship of any kind. To his surprise, she accepted these terms without argument, even adding a few conditions of her own regarding her privacy and autonomy. "I'll have the materials for roof repair delivered tomorrow," Hank told her as she prepared to leave with the sheriff. "Stovepipe too, but the actual work will be my responsibility," she finished for him. "I understand, Mr. Barstow, and I appreciate your accommodation." As they rode away, Sheriff Taylor's grin visible even at a distance, Hank wondered if he'd just made the biggest mistake of his life. But the decision was made, and Hank Barstow was nothing if not a man of his word. True to her promise, Tessa Prescott arrived the following afternoon with a wagon load of her possessions. Hank, who had been splitting firewood near his cabin, watched from a distance as she efficiently unloaded trunks, crates of books, and what appeared to be medical equipment. He'd left the promised building materials stacked neatly beside the line cabin, along with basic tools, but made no move to help her settle in. For 3 days, they maintained this careful distance. Hank would occasionally glimpse her working on the cabin roof or carrying water from the creek, but he deliberately kept to his own tasks. On the fourth morning, however, curiosity got the better of him. He rode past the line cabin, ostensibly checking fence lines, and was startled by the transformation already taking place. The sagging porch had been straightened, the broken windows repaired with old paper until proper glass could be obtained, and smoke rose steadily from the newly repaired chimney. A small garden plot had been marked out despite the winter season, and he could see she'd begun clearing the accumulated debris from years of neglect. As he passed, the cabin door opened, and Tessa emerged wearing men's trousers beneath a heavy coat, her hair tied back with a simple ribbon. She carried a hammer and had smudges of soot on her face, but her expression was one of satisfaction. "Good morning, Mr. Barstow," she called, neither overly familiar nor unfriendly. Hank reined in, feeling oddly caught out. "Roof holding. So far, the new stovepipe makes a world of difference," she gestured toward the cabin. "Would you care to inspect the repairs? It is your property, after all." The invitation was practical rather than social, which made it easier for Hank to accept. He dismounted and approached, noting the neat stack of firewood beside the door and the care she'd taken to repair rather than replace wherever possible. Inside, the transformation was even more remarkable. The single-room cabin had been thoroughly cleaned, the rough plank floor swept, and the stone fireplace cleared of debris. Her few possessions were arranged with military precision. A narrow cot against one wall, a small desk beneath the window, shelves already filled with books and medical supplies. A worn but clean rug covered the center of the floor, and the patched stove gleamed with black polish. "You've been busy," Hank observed, uncomfortable with how homey the once derelict cabin now felt. "There's still much to do," she replied, setting down her hammer, "but it's already more spacious than my quarters at the doctor's office." Hank noticed a collection of glass jars on one shelf, containing various herbs and what appeared to be medicinal compounds. "The sheriff mentioned you were a nurse during the war." She nodded, a shadow crossing her face. "With the Union Army, yes, I was 17 when I volunteered. My father was a doctor in Philadelphia, so I'd grown up learning medicine." "After Gettysburg," she paused, her expression distant. "Well, they needed every pair of hands they could get." 17 during Gettysburg would make her 22 now, Hank calculated silently. Young, but with experiences that would age anyone beyond their years. He'd been 16 when the war ended, too young to fight but old enough to see its aftermath as he'd made his way west. "You mentioned experiments," he said, nodding toward her collection of medicines. "What kind?" For the first time, he saw genuine enthusiasm light her features. "I've been studying the medicinal properties of local plants. Native Americans in this region have used certain herbs for generations that Eastern medicine hasn't documented. Dr. Simmons has allowed me to incorporate some of these treatments with remarkable results." Her passion for her work was evident in the way she spoke, her hands gesturing expressively. Hank found himself listening with unexpected interest as she described her attempts to create a more effective treatment for infection using a combination of traditional medicine and indigenous knowledge. Of course, proper documentation is essential, she concluded, which is why I need the quiet to write and study. Hank nodded, suddenly aware that they'd been having an actual conversation, something he'd actively avoided with most people for years. He took a step back toward the door. Well, the repairs look sound if you need anything else. A sharp crack of gunfire interrupted him, followed immediately by the frightened bellowing of cattle. Hank was moving before the echo faded, rushing out the door with his hand already on his revolver. From the cabin clearing, he could see a plume of dust rising from the east pasture where his herd had been grazing peacefully moments before. "Stay here," he ordered over his shoulder, but Tessa was already behind him, a rifle in her hands that she must have grabbed from beside the door. "How many men work your ranch, Mr. Barstow?" she asked calmly, checking the rifle's loading mechanism with practiced ease. "None, just me." He whistled for Thunderhead, who came trotting from where he'd been ground-tied. Tessa's expression tightened. "Then you're outnumbered. I counted at least 2 shots, likely from different weapons." Another shot rang out, followed by more distressed cattle sounds. Hank swung into the saddle. "Stay here," he repeated firmly. To his frustration, she ignored him, quickly untying her own horse from the hitching post she'd installed. "You need someone to watch your back, Mr. Barstow. This may be the same men who threatened Peterson." There was no time to argue. Hank spurred Thunderhead toward the pasture, acutely aware of Tessa following behind. As they crested the small rise that overlooked the eastern grazing lands, he saw them, 3 riders cutting through his herd, deliberately stampeding the frightened animals toward a broken section of fence line. "They're driving them off," Tessa observed, pulling up beside him. Hank's face hardened. He drew his rifle from its saddle scabbard. "Not my cattle, they ain't." He fired a warning shot high into the air, the report echoing across the valley. The rustlers jerked their heads up, spotting Hank and Tessa on the ridge. 2 immediately broke off their pursuit of the cattle, wheeling their horses toward the tree line. The third, however, raised his own rifle and fired in their direction. Hank felt the bullet whiz past his ear. He leveled his rifle, aiming not at the man but at the ground in front of his horse. The shot kicked up dirt, causing the animal to rear in panic. The rustlers struggled to maintain control, and in that moment of distraction, Tessa fired. Her shot was precise, not aimed to kill but to disable. The rustler's rifle flew from his hands and he cried out, clutching his shoulder. His companions, seeing their advantage lost, fired a few more wild shots before disappearing into the trees. The wounded man tried to follow, but his injured arm made controlling his frightened horse nearly impossible. He slid from the saddle, landing hard in the snow-dusted grass. "Cover me," Hank told Tessa as he urged Thunderhead down the slope toward the fallen man. She nodded, keeping her rifle trained steadily on the tree line where the other 2 had vanished. The rustler was young, barely 20, with a thin face and city clothes unsuited to the Montana winter. Blood seeped through his fingers where he clutched his shoulder, his expression a mixture of pain and fear as Hank approached. "Don't kill me," he gasped, "just doing what I was paid to do." Hank dismounted, keeping his revolver trained on the young man. "Who paid you?" "Man named Hollister. Works for Chicago Consolidated Cattle." The rustler winced as he shifted position. "Said to make it look like you couldn't manage your herd, run off enough stock that you'd be forced to sell by spring." Hank's expression darkened. "Where's Hollister now?" "Town, staying at the hotel." The young man's face was growing pale from shock and blood loss. "We weren't supposed to hurt nobody, just the stock." Tessa rode up, her rifle still at the ready, but her gaze now assessing the man's wound with professional detachment. The bullet passed through the fleshy part of his shoulder, serious but not life-threatening if infection is prevented. "He tried to kill us," Hank reminded her coldly. "He's also your best evidence against this Hollister person." She dismounted smoothly, already reaching into the saddlebag where she apparently kept medical supplies. "If he dies, it's just your word against a wealthy cattle company." Hank knew she was right, though the thought of helping the man who just tried to steal his livelihood rankled. "Fine. But he goes to the sheriff as soon as he can ride." While Tessa worked to staunch the bleeding and bind the wound, Hank retrieved the rustler's horse and the fallen rifle. The other cattle rustlers were long gone, but the immediate threat to his herd was over. Most of the cattle had already begun to settle, returning to their grazing now that the commotion had ceased. "I need to get him to the cabin," Tessa said when she'd finished the field dressing. "The wound needs proper cleaning and stitching." "My prisoner goes in my cellar, not your cabin," Hank stated firmly. Tessa fixed him with a steady gaze. "Your cellar will kill him faster than his wound. If you want him alive to testify against his employer, he needs medical attention in a warm, clean environment. When Hank's expression remained unyielding, she added, I'll be responsible for him. He can be secured to the bed if necessary, but I won't let a man die of infection when I can prevent it, even if he is a rustler. Something in her tone, professional rather than pleading, made Hank relent. Fine. But I'm posting guard outside your door and he's tied. Together, they managed to get the semi-conscious young man onto Tessa's horse. Hank led the way back to the line cabin, his mind racing with the implications of what they'd learned. Chicago Consolidated Cattle was no small outfit. They had money, influence, and apparently no qualms about using underhanded tactics to acquire land they wanted. At the line cabin, Hank secured the rustler to the sturdy frame of Tessa's cot while she prepared her medical instruments. He couldn't help but notice the efficiency with which she worked, her earlier enthusiasm about herbal medicine replaced by the focused intensity of a battlefield surgeon. I'll need hot water and clean cloths, she instructed without looking up, and whiskey if you have it, both for the wound and the patient. Hank nodded, oddly comforted by her competence. He went to fetch the requested items, marveling at how quickly his solitary existence had been upended. Just days ago, this cabin had stood empty, and his biggest concern had been wolves threatening his cattle. Now he had a female tenant performing surgery on a would-be rustler and a powerful cattle company gunning for his land. As he returned with the supplies, Hank paused in the doorway. Tessa was speaking quietly to the rustler, her tone calm and reassuring despite the circumstances. Her hair had come loose from its ribbon during their ride, falling in chestnut waves around her face as she bent over her patient. For a brief, disorienting moment, Hank was struck by the strange domesticity of the scene, as if he were returning home to a family rather than to a criminal and a tenant he barely knew. The thought was so unexpected that it stopped him cold. This was exactly why he'd avoided entanglements of any kind. They complicated everything, muddied clear waters, made a man question himself. Mr. Barstow, Tessa looked up, noticing his hesitation. The water, please. Hank shook off the momentary confusion and stepped inside, setting the kettle on her stove. This wasn't domesticity, it was necessity. Once the rustler was well enough to travel, he'd go to the sheriff, and Hank would deal with Chicago Consolidated Cattle on his own terms. As for Tessa Prescott, she was a tenant, nothing more. The fact that she'd proven herself handy with a rifle and level-headed in a crisis didn't change anything. Or so he told himself as he strode back to his own cabin, determinedly ignoring the strange emptiness that greeted him there. The rustler, who identified himself as Jimmy Coulter, remained under Tessa's care for 2 days. His youth and relative good health worked in his favor, and by the morning of the 3rd day he was well enough to sit up and take solid food. Hank had maintained a watchful presence, splitting his time between checking on his cattle and ensuring their prisoner didn't attempt escape. During those 3 days, an uneasy truce developed between Hank and Tessa. Her focused dedication to her patient's recovery, regardless of his crimes, impressed Hank despite himself. She worked with the quiet efficiency he valued in his own tasks, never complaining about the primitive conditions or the moral ambiguity of treating a man who had tried to harm them. For her part, Tessa seemed to accept Hank's taciturn nature without taking offense. When he brought firewood or fresh water for her patient, she thanked him simply and continued her work. In the evenings, when he insisted on taking the night watch so she could rest, she would leave a plate of whatever simple meal she'd prepared and retire to a makeshift pallet on the floor without argument. On the morning they were to transport Coulter to town, Hank arrived at the line cabin to find Tessa changing the rustler's bandages one final time. Snow had fallen heavily overnight, transforming the landscape into a pristine white expanse that would make travel challenging but not impossible. He should be able to ride if we take it slow, she informed Hank, securing the clean bandage with practiced hands. The wound is healing well with no signs of infection. Jimmy Coulter, looking considerably less threatening than he had with a rifle in his hands, watched Hank nervously. I told her everything I know about Hollister and the company, he said, his voice stronger than it had been. I'll tell the sheriff too. They only hired us 3 days ago, said it was just to run off some cattle, make it look like you couldn't manage your ranch. Hank regarded him coldly. That doesn't excuse trying to shoot us. No, sir, it doesn't. The young man had the grace to look ashamed. I panicked when I saw the lady with a rifle. Never thought you'd have helped way out here. Hollister said you were alone. This confirmed what Hank had suspected. They'd been watching his property, learning his routines. The thought made his skin crawl. How long had he been under observation without realizing it? We should leave soon, Tessa interrupted his thoughts, packing her medical supplies. I'd like to reach town before dark, and the snow will slow us down. Hank nodded. I'll saddle the horses. Outside, as he prepared the mounts, he found himself oddly reluctant to make the journey to town. It wasn't just the cattle company threat, though that certainly weighed on his mind. There was something else, a strange reluctance to return to the world of people and their complications after these few days of unexpected. Not quite companionship, but something close to it. When Tessa emerged from the cabin with Jimmy Coulter, Hank had already decided on their approach. We'll keep him between us, he instructed, helping the wounded man onto his horse. If his friends are watching the trails, I don't want them getting a clear shot at any of us. Tessa nodded, settling her medical bag securely in her saddlebags. I've brought additional bandages and medicines in case we're delayed. She glanced at the heavy clouds overhead. More snow coming by evening, I think. The ride to Whiteridge was tense and silent. Hank kept his rifle across his saddle, eyes constantly scanning the tree lines and ridges for any sign of the other rustlers or their employer. Coulter seemed genuinely repentant, offering information about Hollister's plans unprompted as they rode. He's got men watching most of the small ranches in the county, the young man explained, his breath visible in the cold air. Said by spring, Chicago Consolidated would own everything from the railroad to the mountains. Did he mention any other ranchers by name? Hank asked. Peterson for sure, and somebody named Johnson, said they were the easiest targets, one old, one undermanned. Coulter shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. Also said you'd be the hardest to convince, but that everybody has a breaking point. Hank's jaw tightened. Peterson and Johnson were good men who'd worked hard for their land. The idea that some Eastern corporation could simply decide to take it all made his blood boil. Mr. Barstow, Tessa said quietly, riding up beside him while Coulter dropped slightly behind. I believe we're being followed. Hank didn't turn his head but listened intently as she continued. Two riders keeping to the tree line on our right. They've been paralleling us for the last mile. You've got sharp eyes, Miss Prescott, he murmured, impressed despite the danger. Keep riding normally. Town's less than 3 miles ahead. She nodded almost imperceptibly and dropped back to her position on the other side of their prisoner. Hank casually adjusted his rifle, ensuring it was ready if needed. The snow had begun to fall again, fat flakes that reduced visibility and muffled sounds. Under other circumstances, it might have been peaceful. They were less than 2 miles from town when the first shot rang out, the bullet kicking up snow just ahead of Hank's horse. Thunderhead reared, nearly unseating him as two riders burst from the trees to their right. Ride, Hank shouted to Tessa, wheeling his horse to face the threat. Get Coulter to the sheriff. To his frustration but not his surprise, Tessa instead pulled her own rifle and moved her horse closer to Coulter's, presenting a united front. We're too exposed here, she called over the wind that had begun to pick up. The ridge ahead has better cover. She was right, the open trail left them vulnerable, while the rocky outcropping 100 yards ahead would at least provide some shelter. Hank fired a covering shot toward their pursuers, forcing them to momentarily seek cover, then spurred Thunderhead toward the ridge. They reached the rocks just as another volley of shots cut through the snowy air. Dismounting quickly, Hank helped Coulter down while Tessa secured the horses behind the largest boulder. The young rustler was pale with pain, his wound likely reopened by the rough ride, but he still managed to warn them. That's Hollister himself on the bay horse. He won't let me testify. Hank peered cautiously around the edge of a rock. The two riders had stopped at the tree line, apparently unwilling to charge across the open ground to their position. One was indeed a well-dressed man on a bay horse, Hollister, presumably, while the other appeared to be a hired gun, his stance and the practiced way he held his rifle marking him as a professional. They're pinning us down until dark, Hank assessed grimly. Once night falls, they'll try to circle behind us. We can't stay here that long, Tessa replied, checking Coulter's wound. He's bleeding again and the temperature's dropping. We need to reach town. Hank nodded, calculating distances and options. Town's over that next rise, if we can hold them off long enough for one of us to make a run for it. I'll go, Coulter interrupted unexpectedly. They want me, not you folks. If I ride out, they'll follow me, and you two can get to town for help. Hank stared at the young man in surprise. That's suicide. Maybe, Coulter agreed, grimacing as Tessa tightened a fresh bandage. But it's better than all three of us dying out here. I owe you that much at least after you saved my life. Absolutely not, Tessa said firmly. Your wound would reopen completely and you'd bleed out before reaching town. She turned to Hank. I'll go, I'm the lightest rider, and they're less likely to shoot a woman. No, Hank's response was immediate and firm. I'm not letting you ride into their line of fire. Something flashed in Tessa's green eyes, irritation or perhaps surprise at his protectiveness. Mr. Barstow, this is hardly the time for chivalry. I'm perfectly capable. A bullet striking the rock beside them cut off her argument, sending chips of stone flying. Hank instinctively moved in front of her, shielding her with his body as he returned fire. They're getting bolder, he observed, ducking back down, or more desperate. The snow was falling more heavily now, the wind driving it in swirling patterns that further reduced visibility. It was both a blessing and a curse. The deteriorating weather might conceal a rider making a break for town, but it also increased the chances of getting lost or frostbitten if they remained exposed much longer. Hank made his decision. We go together, all three of us. Coulter between us, using the rocks for cover as long as possible, then a straight run for town. The storm will help hide us once we're past the open ground. Tessa studied his face for a moment, then nodded. It's our best chance, she agreed, but we'll need a distraction to get mounted. Hank reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small metal flask. Coal oil, he explained, for the lanterns. Soaked handkerchief wrapped around a rock should give us enough smoke and flame to cover our departure. Working quickly despite the cold, Hank prepared the makeshift diversion while Tessa readied the horses and helped Coulter stand. The young rustler was unsteady but determined, his earlier offer of sacrifice seeming to have given him a new resolve. On my signal, Hank instructed, striking a lucifer match against a rock, mount fast and ride hard. Don't stop for anything. The oil-soaked cloth caught instantly, flaring bright in the gloom of the snowstorm. Hank hurled it over the rocks toward their attackers, then immediately turned to help Coulter onto his horse. The distraction worked, confused shouts and a few wild shots echoed from the tree line as Hollister and his gunmen tried to determine what had been thrown at them. In those precious seconds of confusion, all three mounted and spurred their horses toward town, keeping low in their saddles. Hank took the rear position, his rifle ready, while Tessa led the way with Coulter close behind her. The snow swallowed them almost immediately, the white curtain of flakes obscuring them from view. They were halfway across the open ground when Hank heard hoofbeats behind them. A glance over his shoulder confirmed his fears. Hollister and his man had recovered from the distraction and were in pursuit. The hired gun was raising his rifle for a shot. Faster, Hank shouted over the wind, wheeling Thunderhead to face the threat. He fired twice in quick succession, not aiming to hit but to force their pursuers to take cover. The tactic worked, but only momentarily. As Hank turned to follow Tessa and Coulter, who were now nearing the top of the rise, a bullet caught him high on his left side, the impact nearly knocking him from the saddle. Pain exploded through his chest, hot and sharp despite the numbing cold. Through sheer determination, Hank managed to stay mounted and continue forward. Thunderhead, sensing his rider's distress, galloped harder, quickly catching up to the others as they crested the rise. From there, Whiteridge was visible in the valley below, its buildings mere shadows through the falling snow. Hank, Tessa cried, noticing his hunched position. You're hit. Keep riding, he gritted through clenched teeth. Almost there. The last mile to town passed in a blur of pain and cold for Hank. He was vaguely aware of Tessa dropping back to ride beside him, her face tight with concern. Twice she reached out to steady him when he began to list in the saddle. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit had faded, either because Hollister had given up or because the storm had swallowed all sound. As they entered the main street of Whiteridge, Tessa took charge, directing them straight to the sheriff's office rather than the doctor's. Coulter needs protection first, she explained when Hank questioned her through pain-fogged consciousness. Your wound isn't immediately life-threatening. Sheriff Taylor was appropriately shocked when they burst into his office, snow-covered and blood-stained. Good God, what happened? He demanded, rushing to help Hank from his horse. Chicago Consolidated Cattle Company happened, Hank managed, the edges of his vision growing dark as the adrenaline that had kept him going began to fade. They're trying to run us off our land. The last thing he heard before consciousness deserted him was Tessa's clear voice instructing the sheriff to fetch Dr. Simmons and prepare a posse. Then darkness claimed him, and he knew no more. Hank awoke to the familiar smell of antiseptic and the unfamiliar sensation of being in a proper bed. He blinked slowly, his eyes adjusting to the dim light of what he recognized as Dr. Simmons's back room. His side throbbed dully, but the sharp, burning pain had subsided to a manageable ache. "Welcome back to the land of the living, Mr. Barstow," came Tessa's voice from beside him. He turned his head carefully to find her seated in a straight-backed chair, a medical text open on her lap. She looked tired but composed, her chestnut hair neatly braided and hanging over one shoulder. "How long?" he managed, his voice raspy from disuse. "2 days," she replied, setting aside her book to pour him a glass of water from a pitcher on the bedside table. "The bullet broke a rib but missed anything vital. You lost a fair amount of blood, though, and developed a slight fever the first night." Hank accepted the water gratefully, surprised by the gentleness of her hands as she helped him sit up enough to drink. Coulter. Safe in the sheriff's jail with 2 deputies guarding him. His testimony was enough for Sheriff Taylor to arrest Hollister when he finally showed his face in town yesterday. A small, satisfied smile curved her lips. "Apparently, Hollister didn't expect us to make it back at all. He was quite shocked to find the sheriff waiting for him at the hotel." Relief washed over Hank, followed immediately by concern. "My cattle are being tended by Johnson and his sons," Tessa assured him. "The sheriff organized a rotating watch of local ranchers to keep an eye on all the threatened properties until the situation with Chicago Consolidated is resolved." Hank settled back against the pillows, processing this information. The community had rallied together in his absence, something he would never have expected, given his deliberate isolation over the years. "Thank you," he said finally, meeting Tessa's steady gaze, "for everything." She shook her head slightly. "No need for thanks, Mr. Barstow. You would have done the same for me, I think." The simple statement contained a deeper truth that Hank wasn't quite ready to examine. Instead, he asked, "When can I leave?" "Dr. Simmons says tomorrow if your fever doesn't return, but you'll need at least 2 weeks of rest before resuming normal activities." Her tone became professionally firm. "That rib needs time to knit, and the wound must heal completely to avoid infection." Hank frowned. 2 weeks of inactivity would be torture, especially with his cattle and property vulnerable. "I can't just lie around while—" "You can and you will," Tessa interrupted with unexpected authority. "Unless you'd prefer to tear open your wound and spend the rest of winter recovering from a much more serious infection." Their gazes locked in a silent battle of wills. To Hank's surprise, he found himself relenting first. "Fine, but I'm going back to my own cabin. No offense to Dr. Simmons, but I'd rather recover on my own property." Something like amusement flickered in her green eyes. "I thought you might say that. I've already arranged for Johnson's wagon to take you home tomorrow, weather permitting." She rose from her chair, smoothing her skirts. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I should inform Dr. Simmons that you're awake. He'll want to examine you himself." As she turned to leave, Hank found himself oddly reluctant to see her go. "Miss Prescott," he called after her. She paused at the door, looking back inquiringly. "How's the line cabin roof holding up in the snow?" A genuine smile transformed her face, warming her eyes in a way that caused an unexpected tightening in Hank's chest. "Perfectly dry, Mr. Barstow." "Thank you for asking." After she left, Hank stared at the ceiling, troubled by his own reactions. Something had shifted between them during their ordeal, a respect born of shared danger, perhaps, or simply the recognition of a kindred spirit who valued independence and competence. Whatever it was, it complicated the neat boundaries he'd established around his solitary existence, and the most troubling part was that he wasn't entirely sure he minded. True to her word, Tessa had arranged for Hank's transportation back to his ranch the following day. Johnson himself drove the wagon, filling Hank in on the developments of the past days. Chicago Consolidated's scheme had apparently extended beyond Whiteridge County, with similar tactics being employed in several territories. Telegrams had been sent to federal authorities, and there was talk of an investigation. "Whole town's buzzing about how you and Doc's lady assistant brought in that rustler and exposed the plot," Johnson told him as they bumped along the snowy road. "Never would have pegged you for working with anyone, Barstow." Hank grunted noncommittally, uncomfortable with being the subject of town gossip. Miss Prescott proved herself handy in a crisis. Johnson chuckled, his breath frosting in the cold air. "That's putting it mildly from what I hear. Sheriff says she's a crack shot and kept her head when bullets were flying. Reminds some folks of those tales about Calamity Jane, except with medical training and proper manners." The comparison irritated Hank for reasons he couldn't quite articulate. Tessa Prescott was nothing like the wild, rough-living women who occasionally made names for themselves on the frontier. She was educated, composed, and utterly feminine despite her practical approach to frontier living. Not that it mattered to him one way or another, he reminded himself sternly. As they approached his property, Hank was surprised to see smoke rising from both chimneys, his main cabin and the line cabin. Johnson followed his gaze and explained, "Miss Prescott rode out at first light to get things ready for you. Said a wounded man shouldn't come home to a cold hearth." Something warm and unfamiliar expanded in Hank's chest at this news. No one had thought about his comfort or well-being in such a way since his mother had passed. The feeling was so foreign that he immediately distrusted it, hardening his expression as Johnson helped him down from the wagon. Tessa emerged from his cabin as they approached, wiping her hands on a small apron tied over her dress. "Right on time," she called. "I've just put coffee on to boil." Johnson tipped his hat to her. "I'll get Mr. Barstow settled, then head back. Got my own place to tend to." "I can manage from here," Hank insisted, not wanting to appear helpless despite the pain that radiated from his wounded side with every movement. Johnson looked doubtful, but Tessa intervened smoothly. "Of course you can, Mr. Barstow, but do allow Mr. Johnson to help you inside while I fetch your medical supplies from the line cabin. Dr. Simmons sent specific instructions for your care." There was something in her tone, not quite condescension but a gentle authority, that prevented Hank from arguing further. He allowed Johnson to support him into the cabin, where he was surprised to find everything in perfect order. A fire blazed cheerfully in the hearth, fresh bedding had been laid on his bunk, and the dusty surfaces had been cleaned. Someone, Tessa, obviously, had taken the time to make his sparse home comfortable for his recovery. Once Johnson had departed and Tessa had returned with her medical bag, an awkward silence fell between them. Hank sat stiffly in his chair by the fire, acutely aware of being in his own space with a woman for the first time in years. "I should examine your wound," Tessa said finally, all professional efficiency. "Dr. Simmons wants the bandages changed twice daily to prevent infection." Hank nodded stiffly. "If you'll just show me how, I can manage it myself." She fixed him with a look that he was beginning to recognize, patient but unyielding. "Mr. Barstow, you cannot properly clean and bandage a wound on your own side. The angle is impossible, and you risk tearing your stitches with the attempt." She began laying out clean bandages and antiseptic. "Now, if you would please remove your shirt." The clinical detachment in her voice should have made the request less awkward, but Hank still felt a flush of discomfort as he carefully unbuttoned his shirt. Tessa, however, remained entirely professional, her gaze assessing the bandaged area with a nurse's practiced eye rather than a woman's curiosity. "The wound looks clean," she observed as she carefully removed the old bandage. "No signs of infection, though the bruising is quite extensive." Her hands were cool and gentle on his skin, her movements practiced and efficient. Hank focused on the fire, trying to ignore the strange intimacy of the moment. Few people had touched him in recent years, and none with such care. "How long will you need to do this?" he asked, his voice sounding strangely rough to his own ears. "The stitches should be ready to remove in about 10 days, she replied, applying a fresh bandage. "After that, it's simply a matter of keeping the area clean until fully healed." She secured the bandage with practiced ease. "You can put your shirt back on now." As Hank carefully redressed, Tessa moved to the stove to pour the promised coffee. The domestic scene was so unexpectedly normal that it caught him off guard, this capable, intelligent woman moving comfortably around his kitchen as if she belonged there. "I've prepared a stew," she informed him, setting a cup of coffee on the table beside him. "It should provide several days' worth of meals while you're recovering. Mr. Johnson also brought supplies from town, enough that you shouldn't need to exert yourself for at least a week." Hank frowned. "You didn't have to do all this." "I know," she met his gaze directly, those clear green eyes untroubled. "I wanted to. You were injured protecting me as much as yourself." "I would have done the same for anyone," he said automatically. A small smile touched her lips. "Would you? From what I've gathered, Hank Barstow isn't known for involving himself in others' troubles." The gentle challenge in her voice unsettled him. That was different. "They were threatening my land." "Yes," she agreed, taking a seat across from him with her own cup of coffee. "Your land matters to you, as does your independence. I respect that, which is why I'll return to the line cabin once I've ensured you're settled." I have no intention of intruding on your solitude more than medically necessary. Hank should have felt relieved by this statement. Instead, he experienced an inexplicable disappointment. The line cabin must be cold, he found himself saying, with the storm. I've managed quite well, she assured him. The repairs have made it quite snug, and I've learned to be resourceful. She took a sip of her coffee, studying him over the rim, though I must admit I was surprised when you agreed to rent it to me. Your reputation for avoiding entanglements of any kind is quite established in Whiteridge. Hank shifted uncomfortably both from his wound and the conversation, seemed practical at the time. Her noncommittal response suggested she didn't entirely believe him. Well, I'm grateful nonetheless. It's exactly what I needed, space to work without constant scrutiny. She set down her cup. Speaking of which, I should check on my patient. Jimmy Coulter may be a would-be rustler, but his recovery remains my professional responsibility. The mention of Coulter reminded Hank of the larger situation at hand. Has there been any word about the other rustlers or Chicago Consolidated's directors? The Telegraph has been busy, she confirmed. Sheriff Taylor received word yesterday that federal marshals are being dispatched to investigate the company's activities across several territories. Apparently, your situation wasn't isolated. And Hollister, still in custody, his employers have disavowed any knowledge of his tactics, of course. Her expression turned wry. Corporations rarely admit to criminal activity, even when caught. The conversation had taken on a comfortable rhythm that surprised Hank. Despite his habitual reclusiveness, he found talking with Tessa easy, her intelligence and direct manner eliminating the need for social niceties he'd never mastered. As she prepared to leave, gathering her medical supplies, Hank felt compelled to say something more. Miss Prescott, thank you not just for this, he gestured to his bandaged side, but for your quick thinking during the ambush. Not many would have kept their composure under fire. She paused at the door, a slight flush coloring her cheeks at the unexpected praise. As I said, Mr. Barstow, I've seen worse. The war taught me that panic is a luxury no one can afford in a crisis. She donned her coat and pulled on her gloves. I'll return this evening to check your wound again. Try to rest in the meantime. After she left, Hank remained by the fire, mulling over the events of the past week. His ordered, solitary existence had been thoroughly disrupted, first by Tessa's arrival, then by Chicago Consolidated's threats, and now by his injury. Yet instead of resenting these disruptions as he would have expected, he found himself considering them with a strange sense of possibility. The thought was so foreign that he immediately tried to dismiss it. He had built his life around independence precisely because it was safer. Attachment meant vulnerability, and vulnerability inevitably led to loss. That was the lesson his mother's death had taught him, and it had served him well for over a decade. So why, he wondered as he stared into the fire, did his solitary cabin suddenly feel emptier than it had before? The next 2 weeks established a routine that gradually became familiar. Tessa visited twice daily to change Hank's bandages and check his healing progress. These visits, initially awkward and strictly professional, slowly evolved into something more comfortable. Conversation began to flow more naturally between them, extending beyond medical matters to discussions of books. They discovered a shared appreciation for Greek classics, ranching techniques, and local politics. Hank learned that Tessa had come west not only to practice medicine more freely, but to escape the suffocating expectations of Philadelphia society after the war. Her father, a respected physician, had supported her medical aspirations, but his death 2 years prior had left her at the mercy of well-meaning relatives who considered nursing an acceptable temporary occupation for a war widow, but certainly not a lifelong calling for an unmarried woman of good family. You were married? Hank asked one evening as she carefully examined his healing wound. Tessa's hands remained steady, though something flickered briefly in her eyes. Briefly, Robert was a lieutenant in the Pennsylvania Volunteers. We married 2 weeks before his regiment left for the front. He died at Cold Harbor in '64. The simple statement contained volumes of unspoken grief. Hank, who rarely felt the need to fill silences, found himself wanting to offer some comfort. I'm sorry. It was a long time ago, she replied, securing a fresh bandage. We barely knew each other, really. The war made everyone rush important decisions. She met his gaze directly. Is that why you prefer solitude, Mr. Barstow? Some lost during the war. Hank was startled by the personal question, but something about the evening, the warmth of the fire, the howling storm outside, the peculiar intimacy of being tended to loosened his usual reticence. Before the war, he admitted, my father was killed by raiders when I was 14. My mother, she loved him too much to survive his loss, wasted away over the next 2 years. He stared into the fire, his voice low. I learned then that loving someone gives them the power to destroy you, even after they're gone. Tessa was quiet for a long moment, her hands still resting lightly on the edge of the bandage. That's a heavy lesson for a boy to learn, she finally said, and a lonely philosophy to live by. It's kept me alive, Hank replied with a shrug that sent a twinge of pain through his healing side. Alive, yes, she began packing her medical supplies, her movements deliberate. But is mere survival enough, Mr. Barstow? Is that truly all you want from life? The question lingered between them, unanswered, as she prepared to leave. Outside, the wind had picked up considerably, driving snow against the cabin windows with increasing force. You shouldn't go back to the line cabin in this, Hank said, rising carefully from his chair. The storm's worsening. Tessa glanced out the window, frowning at the near whiteout conditions. It does look rather fierce. Stay here, he found himself offering. Take the bed, I'll sleep in the chair by the fire. She turned to him, surprise evident in her expression. That would hardly be proper, Mr. Barstow. And your injury is healing well by your own assessment. He gestured toward the window. That storm could easily disorient you between here and the line cabin. It's not worth risking frostbite or worse for the sake of propriety. Tessa hesitated, clearly weighing the danger against social conventions. Finally, practicality won out. Very well, but I insist you keep your bed. The chair will be perfectly adequate for me. I won't hear of it, Hank stated firmly. I've slept in worse conditions than a chair by a warm fire. The bed is yours for the night. Their gazes locked in another battle of wills, but this time it was Tessa who relented. Thank you, she said simply. I accept your hospitality, but only for tonight. The evening that followed was unlike any Hank had experienced in years. After a simple supper of reheated stew, they sat by the fire, the howling storm creating a cocoon of isolation around the cabin that made conversation seem natural rather than forced. Tessa proved to be a thoughtful conversationalist, neither filling silences needlessly nor allowing them to stretch uncomfortably long. Have you always wanted to be a rancher? She asked as the fire burned low. Hank considered the question. Not always. As a boy, I thought I might follow my father into the army. After he died, I just knew I wanted land of my own, something no one could take from me. And have you found what you were looking for here? Mostly, he admitted. The land is good, the cattle are thriving, I've built something that will last. She studied him in the firelight, her green eyes thoughtful. Built, yes, but not shared, doesn't that ever grow lonely? The directness of her question might have offended him coming from anyone else, but Tessa's genuine curiosity and lack of judgment made honesty easier. Sometimes, he acknowledged, winter nights mostly when there's nothing but silence for weeks on end. Then why refuse every overture from the women in town? Surely not all of them were unsuitable. Hank shifted in his chair, uncomfortable with the personal turn of the conversation, yet strangely unwilling to end it. It wasn't about them being unsuitable, it was about me not wanting what they were offering. And what was that? A conventional life, children underfoot, Sunday socials and town gossip. He met her gaze steadily. I saw what my father's death did to my mother. I won't put anyone through that, and I won't experience it myself again. Tessa was quiet for a long moment, the firelight playing across her features. That assumes all women want the same things, she finally said, or that all relationships follow the same pattern. She leaned forward slightly. Has it occurred to you, Mr. Barstow, that there might be women who value independence as much as you do, who might want companionship without suffocation? The question hung in the air between them, weighted with implications neither was quite ready to explore. Hank found himself studying her face, the intelligence in her clear green eyes, the quiet strength in her expression, the way the firelight brought out the gold highlights in her chestnut hair. For the first time, he allowed himself to fully acknowledge her beauty, not just as an objective fact, but as something that affected him personally. I should prepare for sleep, Tessa said softly, breaking the moment. It's been a long day. Hank nodded, grateful for the respite from thoughts that threatened to undermine years of carefully maintained emotional discipline. He showed her where he kept clean linens, offered her privacy to prepare for bed, and settled himself in the chair with extra blankets. Later, as he stared into the dying embers of the fire, listening to the even breathing of the woman asleep in his bed, Hank confronted an uncomfortable truth. His fortress of solitude had been breached, not by force but by the quiet competence and undemanding presence of Tessa Prescott. The realization was both terrifying and strangely liberating. Sleep was a long time coming that night. The storm raged for 3 days, confining them to the cabin. What might have been an awkward imprisonment became instead a surprising revelation for Hank. Tessa's presence, rather than grating on his solitary nature, somehow enhanced his space. She respected his silences, contributed meaningfully to conversations, and maintained a careful balance between assisting him and preserving his independence as he healed. They fell into a natural rhythm of shared tasks, Hank tending the fire and handling the heavier chores his healing wound permitted, Tessa preparing meals and keeping the cabin orderly. In the evenings, they read by lamplight, occasionally sharing passages that struck them or discussing ideas the texts provoked. On the morning of the fourth day, the storm finally broke. Sunlight streamed through the windows, reflecting brilliantly off the pristine snowdrifts that had transformed the landscape. Hank stood at the window, absorbing the stillness that always followed a major storm, when Tessa joined him. "Beautiful," she murmured, her breath fogging the cold glass. "Though I should probably check on the line cabin today. The roof may need clearing if the snow was as deep as it looks." Hank nodded, surprised by his reluctance to see her return to her own quarters. "I'll help, my side's healing well enough for light work." She gave him a skeptical look. "I'm still your medical provider, Mr. Barstow, and I cannot recommend roof clearing as light work for a man with a healing gunshot wound." "I wasn't planning to climb up myself," he clarified, "but I can manage the long rake from the ground. Between the two of us, we should make quick work of it." She seemed about to argue further when a sound caught their attention, the distant but unmistakable lowing of cattle in distress. Hank tensed immediately, moving to grab his coat and rifle. "The storm must have driven part of the herd into the North Ravine," he explained, wincing as he shrugged into his coat. "If they're trapped there in deep snow, they'll die without help." "You can't possibly manage a cattle rescue in your condition," Tessa protested. "I don't have a choice." He checked his rifle, then began gathering rope and other supplies. "Every head of cattle represents months of work and future income. I can't afford to lose them." Tessa watched him for a moment, then made a decisive movement toward her own coat. "Then I'm coming with you. You'll need an extra pair of hands, and I refuse to let you tear open that wound after all my careful tending." Hank started to refuse, then reconsidered. The cattle were indeed in danger, and his injury would make the work significantly more difficult alone. "Can you ride astride?" he asked instead. "Side saddle won't work where we're going." "I've been riding astride since I arrived in Whiteridge," she replied, already pulling on her gloves. "Dr. Simmons considers it scandalous, but practical considerations outweigh social ones in my view." This simple statement, delivered matter-of-factly, struck Hank as perfectly encapsulating Tessa's approach to frontier life. She respected traditions and proprieties when reasonable, but refused to let them interfere with necessary work. It was an attitude he found himself increasingly admiring. They prepared quickly, Tessa changing into the practical trousers she wore for riding while Hank saddled their horses. The temperature had risen slightly with the sunshine, but the air remained bitterly cold, their breath forming clouds around their faces as they rode toward the sound of distressed cattle. The North Ravine was exactly as Hank had feared. Half a dozen of his best breeding cows had sought shelter there during the storm, only to find themselves trapped as snow drifted high at the narrow entrance. The animals were bunched together for warmth, their usual placidity replaced by nervous lowing as hunger and thirst began to take their toll. "We need to clear a path wide enough for them to file out in a line," Hank explained, surveying the situation. "Then lead them back to the main pasture, where the snow's been trampled down by the rest of the herd." Tessa nodded, already dismounting. "I'll start at the far end if you can manage the section nearest the cattle. They're more likely to remain calm with someone they recognize." They worked steadily for over an hour, using shovels and their horses' strength to clear a pathway through the snowdrifts. Hank found himself impressed yet again by Tessa's stamina and practical approach. She worked without complaint despite the cold and physical exertion, her movements efficient and purposeful. When the path was finally clear, Hank used a technique his father had taught him long ago, a low, soothing whistle combined with gentle movements that encouraged the lead cow to follow him out of the ravine. The others fell in behind, their instinct to follow the herd leader overcoming their fear of the narrow snow corridor. "They're beautiful animals," Tessa observed as the last cow cleared the ravine. "Herefords, aren't they?" Hank nodded, pleased by her recognition of the breed. "Best cattle for this climate, hardy, good mothers, and they fatten well on Montana grass." "You've built an impressive operation for a man working alone," she said, genuine admiration in her voice. "Most ranches this size would have at least 2 or 3 hands." "Been considering hiring help," Hank admitted as they began herding the cattle toward the main pasture. "The herd's grown beyond what one man can reasonably manage, especially through winters like this." "Yet you hesitate," she observed. "Because it would mean allowing others into your carefully constructed solitude." Her insight was uncomfortably accurate, partly, he acknowledged, and partly because good help is hard to find. Most drifters aren't looking to settle in for Montana winters. They rode in companionable silence for a while, guiding the cattle across the snow-covered landscape. The physical exertion had brought color to Tessa's cheeks and loosened tendrils of her chestnut hair from beneath her hat, giving her a vitality that Hank found increasingly difficult to ignore. "May I ask you something, Miss Prescott?" he said finally. She glanced at him, curiosity in her green eyes, of course. "Why medicine? It's not a common choice for a woman." Tessa considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I've always been fascinated by the human body, how it works, how it heals, how remarkable yet fragile it is." She guided her horse around a snowdrift before continuing, "But it was the war that truly decided me. Seeing so much death, so much suffering, I needed to believe I could counter at least some small portion of it, that I could help create healing in a world determined to destroy itself." The passion in her voice resonated with something in Hank, a recognition of purpose that transcended conventional expectations. His father had approached military service with similar dedication, and Hank himself felt it about his land and animals. It was the conviction that one's work mattered beyond mere survival or profit. "Your husband," he ventured, uncertain if he was overstepping, "would he have supported your medical ambitions?" A shadow crossed her face, though her voice remained steady. "Robert died before we had the chance to truly know each other's dreams. We married in haste, like so many did during the war." She was quiet for a moment. "But I think he would have understood. He believed in freedom, it's why he fought, and that should extend to the women he loved as well as to strangers." The cattle had reached the main pasture now, quickly integrating with the larger herd that had weathered the storm together. Hank and Tessa reined in their horses on a small rise overlooking the ranch, the winter sun casting long shadows across the pristine snow. "It's truly magnificent," Tessa said softly, taking in the view. "What you've built here." Hank followed her gaze across his property. The sturdy barn and stables, the main cabin with smoke curling from its chimney, the line cabin just visible through the trees, the healthy cattle now safely gathered in the protected pasture. Pride swelled in his chest, along with something else he couldn't quite name. "It's not finished," he found himself saying. "I have plans for expansion, another barn, better corrals. Maybe an orchard on the south slope where it's sheltered from the worst winds." "You're building for the future," she observed, "a legacy." "I suppose I am," he agreed, the realization striking him anew. "Though I've never thought about who it would go to after I'm gone." Tessa turned to look at him directly, her expression open but unreadable. "Perhaps that's something to consider, Mr. Barstow. The most magnificent legacies are diminished if there's no one to appreciate them or carry them forward." Before he could respond to this gentle challenge, a sharp pain lanced through his side. Hank winced, instinctively pressing a hand to his wound. "You've overexerted yourself," Tessa said immediately, professional concern replacing the more personal moment. "We should return to the cabin so I can check your injury." Hank didn't argue, the pain having made a convincing case for her medical authority. They rode back in silence, each absorbed in their own thoughts. As they approached the cabins, Hank made a decision. "Stay at the main cabin again tonight," he said as they dismounted. "The line cabin will be cold and you've worked hard today. No sense in both of us spending a miserable night." Tessa studied him for a moment as if trying to discern his true motives. Whatever she saw in his expression must have reassured her because she nodded. "Thank you. That would be sensible, especially as I should monitor your wound after today's exertion." As they settled back into the main cabin's warmth, Hank found himself reflecting on her words about legacies and futures. He had indeed built with permanence in mind, creating something meant to last beyond a single season or year. Yet he had never seriously considered what would happen to all his work after his death. Without children or family, his ranch would likely be sold off to strangers who might not care for it as he had. The thought was surprisingly troubling. That evening, as Tessa carefully examined his wound, which had indeed been aggravated by the day's work but not seriously damaged, Hank found himself watching her with new eyes. Her competent hands, her focused expression, the gentle confidence with which she tended to his injury, all spoke of a woman who knew her purpose and pursued it with dedication. "You're fortunate," she pronounced as she secured a fresh bandage. "No serious damage, though you'll likely be sore for a few days. I recommend a mustard plaster tonight to help with the inflammation." "I've endured worse," he replied, carefully pulling his shirt back on. "That doesn't mean you should endure unnecessary discomfort." She fixed him with a look that brooked no argument. "Frontier stoicism has its place, Mr. Barstow, but not when simple remedies are available." The corner of his mouth quirked upward at her chiding tone. "Yes, ma'am." She blinked, momentarily startled by his teasing response, then smiled, a genuine expression that transformed her entire face. "Well, I'm glad we understand each other." As she prepared the mustard plaster, moving comfortably around his kitchen, Hank was struck by how natural her presence in his cabin had become in just a few days. The silence between them was no longer awkward or tense but companionable, the quiet of two people comfortable enough with each other to not require constant conversation. It was, he realized with some surprise, a type of intimacy he had not experienced since before his mother's death. Not physical intimacy, but the deeper connection of shared space and purpose, of unspoken understandings and complementary strengths. The realization was unsettling, challenging years of carefully constructed isolation. Hank had convinced himself that his solitary existence was preferable, safer emotionally, simpler practically. Yet the past few days with Tessa had awakened doubts about that conviction. What if there was another way to live, one that preserved independence without demanding complete isolation? As they sat by the fire that evening, the mustard plaster warm against his side and a comfortable silence between them, Hank found the courage to voice the question that had been forming in his mind since their conversation about legacies. "Why did you really come west, Miss Prescott? The truth." Tessa looked up from her book, her expression thoughtful rather than offended by the direct question. "I told you to practice medicine more freely." "That's part of it," he acknowledged. "But not all. You could have gone to Chicago or even Boston for that. Why Montana Territory specifically?" She closed her book, marking her place with a finger. "You're right," she admitted after a moment. "There were other considerations." She gazed into the fire, choosing her words carefully. "After the war, after Robert's death, Philadelphia became suffocating. Everyone knew me as the lieutenant's widow. They had expectations that I would mourn appropriately, then eventually marry again, preferably to one of Robert's fellow officers who had survived." Her voice took on a distant quality, as if she were seeing that past life rather than the cabin around her. "I tried for a while to fit myself back into that world, but the war had changed me. I had seen too much death, too much suffering to be satisfied with a life of social calls and needlepoint. I wanted to continue nursing, to use what I had learned, but that was considered inappropriate for a woman of my background once the emergency of war had passed." She met Hank's gaze directly. "So I came west where the work matters more than one's background or gender, where I could build something of my own on my own terms." A small, wry smile touched her lips. "Not unlike your own journey, I suspect." The parallel was unmistakable, and Hank found himself nodding slowly. "We're both running from something, then." "Or toward something," she countered gently. "That's the question, isn't it? Are we defined by what we're escaping or by what we're seeking?" The question lingered between them as the fire crackled and night deepened outside the cabin windows. For the first time in years, Hank allowed himself to consider that his isolation might be as much prison as protection, that in barricading himself against loss, he had perhaps closed himself off from possibilities that required courage of a different kind. "I should check the mustard plaster," Tessa said finally, setting aside her book. As she carefully removed the plaster and examined the injured area, her touch professional but gentle, Hank made another decision, small but significant. "Hank," he said quietly. She looked up, a question in her eyes. "My friends call me Hank," he clarified. "Not that I have many, but after sharing my cabin for days and tending my gunshot wound, Mr. Barstow seems unnecessarily formal." A smile warmed her eyes. Very well, Hank, and I'm Tessa, though I suspect you've already made that transition in your mind. He realized, had been thinking of her as Tessa for days now, though he'd maintained the formality of Miss Prescott in his speech. The acknowledgement felt like a small but significant shift in their relationship, a tentative step away from the rigid boundaries he'd maintained for so long. As Tessa returned to her book and Hank stared thoughtfully into the fire, a comfortable silence once again enveloped the cabin. Outside, snow began to fall softly, adding fresh powder to the winter's accumulation. But inside, something new and fragile had begun to grow, a possibility neither had anticipated when fate and circumstance had brought them together. The next morning dawned clear and cold, the fresh snow glittering like diamonds in the early sunlight. Hank awoke to the smell of coffee and the quiet sounds of Tessa moving about the kitchen. For a brief, disorienting moment, it felt so natural, so right, that he had to remind himself this was temporary, an arrangement of necessity, not permanence. And yet. He rose carefully, his side still tender but significantly improved from the day before. Tessa glanced up from the stove where she was preparing a simple breakfast of flapjacks and bacon, her chestnut hair neatly braided but not yet pinned up, giving her a more relaxed appearance than usual. "Good morning," she greeted him. "How's the side?" "Better," he replied honestly. "Your mustard plaster seems to have helped." "Good, though you should still take it easy today." She transferred the bacon to a plate. "I thought I'd check on the line cabin this morning and make any necessary repairs. The snow seems to have stopped for now." Hank nodded, pouring himself coffee from the pot she'd prepared. "I'll come with you. Need to check the south fence line anyway. It tends to collect drifts that can give wolves access if not cleared." They ate breakfast together, discussing the day's tasks with the easy familiarity of people who had worked together for years rather than days. It struck Hank again how naturally they had fallen into a rhythm of shared space and purpose, each respecting the other's competence while finding ways to complement each other's strengths. After breakfast, they bundled up against the cold and set out toward the line cabin, walking side by side through snow that reached past their knees in places. The exertion warmed them despite the biting chill in the air, and Hank found himself enjoying the simple pleasure of company on what would normally have been a solitary task. The line cabin appeared to have weathered the storm well. Tessa's repairs to the roof had held, though additional snow needed to be cleared to prevent undue strain on the aging timbers. While Hank carefully used the long-handled rake to pull snow from the roof edges, Tessa cleared the path to the door and checked the chimney. "It looks sound," she reported, stepping back to survey their work. "Though I should probably replenish the firewood supply before the next storm." "We can do that this afternoon," Hank replied, the week coming naturally now. "There's a fallen pine about 100 yards east that should be dry enough to split." Tessa nodded, brushing snow from her gloves. "Shall we check your fence line before returning for tools?" They walked together toward the southern boundary of Hank's property, where a stretch of barbed wire separated his grazing land from the steeper, more rugged terrain beyond. As Tessa had predicted, snow had drifted against the fence in places, creating potential pathways for predators to cross over or under the barrier. As they worked to clear these drifts, a movement in the distance caught Hank's attention. He straightened, shading his eyes against the glare of sunlight on snow, and felt his body tense with recognition. "Riders," he said quietly, his hand instinctively moving toward his revolver before he remembered he'd left it at the cabin, not expecting trouble so close to home. Tessa followed his gaze. "5 of them," she observed. "Too many for more cattle rustlers, surely." Hank wasn't so certain. Chicago Consolidated might have decided to take more direct action after Hollister's arrest. "Get back to the cabin," he instructed. "My rifle's there and—" "I'm not leaving you unarmed," she interrupted firmly. "Besides, they've already seen us. Running would only make us look vulnerable." She was right, Hank realized with a mixture of frustration and admiration. The riders had definitely spotted them and were now changing direction to intercept their position. Better to face them together, presenting a united front, than to separate and potentially be caught individually. "Stay behind me," he said, reaching down to pick up the shovel they'd been using to clear snow. Not much of a weapon, but better than nothing. "I think not," Tessa replied, hefting her own shovel with determined grace. "We face them as equals or not at all." Before Hank could argue further, the riders were upon them, 5 men on horseback, well-dressed despite the harsh weather. To his surprise, the leader was not another hired gun or corporate representative, but Sheriff Taylor himself, accompanied by what appeared to be 4 businessmen from their attire. "Morning, Hank," the sheriff called, reining in his horse. "Sorry to surprise you folks, but these gentlemen were most insistent on speaking with you directly." He didn't look entirely happy about the situation. "This is Mr. Edison from the Territorial Governor's Office and representatives from the Department of Justice in Washington." Hank lowered his shovel slightly, wariness replacing immediate alarm. "What's this about, Sheriff?" One of the men, a distinguished-looking gentleman with silver at his temples, urged his horse forward. "Mr. Barstow, I'm Jonathan Edison, Special Assistant to Governor Potts. We've been investigating Chicago Consolidated Cattle Company's activities throughout the territory, and your testimony, along with that of the young man you apprehended, has proven invaluable." Another man, younger but with the hardened look of a lawman, joined him. "Marshal James Cooper, Department of Justice. Thanks to the evidence you and Miss Prescott provided, we've been able to build a case against not just Hollister but several directors of the company. They've been engaged in similar intimidation tactics across 3 territories." Hank exchanged a glance with Tessa, who appeared as surprised as he felt by this turn of events. "I'm glad to hear that," he said cautiously. "But it doesn't explain why 5 of you rode out here rather than sending a message through normal channels." Edison cleared his throat. "Ah, well, that's the other matter we needed to discuss. You see, with the principal directors of Chicago Consolidated facing charges, the company's assets are being liquidated, including several properties they had already acquired in this region. One of which," the marshal continued, "happens to be adjacent to your ranch, the old Henderson place to the south. It's been unoccupied since Chicago Consolidated forced Henderson out last year." Hank frowned. "I'm familiar with it. Good water, decent grazing land." "Precisely," Edison nodded. "The territorial government has first right of refusal on the liquidated properties, and Governor Potts believes the most equitable solution is to offer them to local ranchers who were targeted by the company's illegal activities." Understanding dawned on Hank. "You're offering me the Henderson place?" "At a significantly reduced price, yes," Edison confirmed. "Compensation for the company's attempts to force you off your land and recognition of your role in bringing their activities to light." It was an unexpected opportunity, one that would nearly double the size of his ranch and provide access to the year-round spring on the Henderson property that would be invaluable during Montana's dry summers. Yet Hank hesitated, his mind racing with implications. "That's very generous," he said carefully, "but I operate alone. Taking on that much additional land would require help I don't currently have." "A problem many ranchers face," Edison acknowledged. "Which brings me to the second purpose of our visit. The governor is establishing a program to help veterans find employment in the territories. Many former soldiers are struggling to reintegrate into civilian life back east. We believe offering them opportunities out west, where their skills and discipline would be valued, could benefit everyone involved." The marshal nodded. "Good men who just need a fresh start." "If you were interested in the Henderson property, the program could subsidize wages for 2 ranch hands for the first year. Veterans who'd be grateful for honest work and might become permanent employees if the arrangement proved satisfactory." It was, Hank had to admit, an elegant solution to both problems. The additional land would make his ranch one of the most substantial in the county, and having reliable help would allow him to manage the expanded operation effectively. Yet it would also fundamentally change his existence, from solitary rancher to employer, from man alone to head of a small community. He glanced at Tessa, who had remained quiet during this exchange, her expression thoughtful but unreadable. "I'd need time to consider," he told Edison. "This isn't a decision to make lightly." Of course, Edison reached into his coat and withdrew an envelope. "All the details are here, the terms of purchase, the veterans program, everything you need to know. We'll be in Whiteridge for 3 more days before continuing on to Helena." The sheriff, who had been watching the proceedings with interest, finally spoke up. "It's a good opportunity, Hank. Henderson's place has the best water right south of the Bitterroots. Shame to see it go to some eastern speculator who'd never set foot on the land." Hank accepted the envelope with a nod. "I'll give it serious thought, Sheriff." As the men prepared to leave, Edison turned to Tessa. "Miss Prescott, I understand from Dr. Simmons that you've been conducting some promising research on local medicinal plants." Tessa straightened slightly, clearly surprised to be addressed. "Yes, sir. I've been documenting their properties and traditional uses. with some encouraging results for treating infections and fevers. Edison smiled. The territorial government is establishing a small research hospital in Helena focused on frontier medicine. They're looking for trained medical professionals with precisely your experience. If you're interested, I'd be happy to provide an introduction. Now it was Hank's turn to watch Tessa's reaction, a sudden tightness in his chest that he wasn't prepared to examine too closely. Her eyes had widened with interest at the mention of a research hospital, exactly the type of opportunity she'd come west seeking, where her medical knowledge would be valued and expanded. "That's very interesting," she said carefully. "I would certainly like to learn more about it." "Excellent, I've included information about that program as well." Edison gestured toward the envelope Hank held, "for both your considerations." With that, the visitors departed, leaving Hank and Tessa standing amid the snow-covered landscape, possibilities swirling around them like the occasional flurries still drifting from the leaden sky. They walked back to the main cabin in silence, each absorbed in their own thoughts. Only when they were inside, warming themselves by the fire, did Tessa finally speak. "Are you going to accept?" she asked quietly. Hank stared into the flames, turning the envelope over in his hands. "I don't know yet, it's a significant change. But one with considerable advantages," she pointed out. "The water rights alone would make your ranch more viable in drought years." He nodded, acknowledging the practical truth of her statement. "And you, the research hospital in Helena, it sounds like what you came west to find." Tessa was quiet for a long moment, her expression contemplative. "It does have appeal," she admitted finally. "The opportunity to conduct proper research, to perhaps develop treatments that could help people throughout the territories." Her voice trailed off, and she met his gaze directly. "But I've found unexpected value here as well." The simple statement hung in the air between them, laden with unspoken meaning. Hank found himself unable to look away from her clear green eyes, which seemed to be asking a question he wasn't sure he was ready to answer. "Your lease on the line cabin is paid through spring," he said instead. "You're welcome to stay as long as you wish, regardless of my decision about the Henderson place." Something like disappointment flickered briefly in her expression before she schooled her features back to composure. "Thank you, that's very considerate." The rest of the day passed in a strange tension neither acknowledged directly. They completed their tasks, splitting firewood, stocking both cabins, tending to basic repairs with their usual efficiency, but the easy companionship of previous days had been replaced by a careful politeness that felt brittle and forced. That evening, Tessa announced her intention to return to the line cabin, now that it was properly heated and stocked with firewood. "Your wound is healing well," she explained, packing her medical supplies. "Daily checks should suffice from now on, rather than constant monitoring." Hank didn't argue, though a part of him wanted to. Instead, he helped carry her belongings back to the line cabin and ensured she had everything needed for a comfortable night. As he prepared to leave, standing awkwardly at her door, Tessa spoke. "Hank," she said softly, using his given name with a deliberate intimacy that caught his attention. "Whatever you decide about the Henderson place, I hope you'll consider what we discussed earlier about legacies and futures. You've built something remarkable here. It deserves to continue in whatever form you choose." He nodded, uncertain how to respond to the gentle challenge in her words. "Good night, Tessa." "Good night." Walking back to his own cabin through the snow, Hank felt the weight of decisions pressing down on him more heavily than the Montana winter. For so long he had defined himself by his isolation, had convinced himself it was safer, simpler, better. Yet these past weeks had shown him another possibility, one he had never allowed himself to seriously consider. Could there be a middle path, a way to maintain his independence without complete isolation, to build connections that strengthened rather than weakened him? And most troubling of all, what would it mean if Tessa accepted the position in Helena? The thought of returning to his solitary existence after experiencing these weeks of shared purpose left a hollow feeling in his chest that he couldn't quite ignore. Inside his cabin, Hank opened Edison's envelope and spread the documents on his table. The terms for purchasing the Henderson property were indeed generous, far below market value, with favorable payment conditions. The Veterans Program was equally well designed, offering quality workers at subsidized wages to help ranchers expand operations that would ultimately benefit the territory's economy. It made perfect sense from a practical standpoint. Yet Hank hesitated, not because the offer wasn't advantageous, but because accepting it meant embracing a future fundamentally different from the one he had envisioned for himself. It meant employees to manage, responsibilities beyond his own survival, and a more prominent position in the county that would inevitably draw him into the community he had so carefully avoided. As the fire burned low and night deepened around the cabin, Hank came to a realization that both troubled and liberated him. His carefully constructed isolation had become a habit rather than a necessity. What had once been protection against the pain of loss had gradually transformed into a prison of his own making, limiting not just his ranch's growth but his own. The question was whether he had the courage to step beyond those self-imposed boundaries and whether there was sufficient reason to take that risk. As he finally sought his bed, Hank's thoughts returned to Tessa and the research hospital in Helena. The opportunity was perfect for her talents and ambitions. He wouldn't stand in the way of that, regardless of the strange emptiness the thought of her departure created. But perhaps, he thought as sleep finally claimed him, there was a different solution, one that required more courage than he had needed to face down rustlers and cattle barons. One that acknowledged the truth he had been avoiding since that first snowbound night when Tessa had challenged his solitary philosophy. Morning would bring clarity, one way or another. Hank rose before dawn the next day, his mind made up. After checking his cattle and completing essential chores, he saddled Thunderhead and rode toward town, leaving a brief note for Tessa explaining his absence. The ride gave him time to solidify his plans and gather his thoughts, the crisp winter air clearing his head of lingering doubts. Whiteridge was already bustling despite the early hour when he arrived. The railroad had indeed transformed the once sleepy settlement, bringing new businesses and residents eager to establish themselves in the growing frontier town. Hank tied Thunderhead outside the sheriff's office and entered to find Sheriff Taylor at his desk, eyebrows rising in surprise at this unexpected visit. "Hank, didn't expect to see you in town so soon after yesterday's meeting. You come to a decision already." "I have," Hank confirmed, removing his hat as he took a seat across from the lawman. "I'm accepting Edison's offer on the Henderson place, and the Veterans Program too." The sheriff's face broke into a broad smile. "That's good news, real good news. Always thought that property and yours would make a fine combined operation." He studied Hank's face curiously. "What changed your mind about expanding? You've been pretty set on managing alone all these years." Hank considered his answer carefully. Circumstances change, a man either adapts or gets left behind. The sheriff's expression turned knowing. "Wouldn't have anything to do with a certain medical lady taking up residence in your line cabin, would it?" Hank's jaw tightened slightly, though he wasn't truly annoyed by the question. "Miss Prescott's presence has been instructive in certain ways," he admitted, "but this decision is about the future of my ranch, nothing more." "If you say so." Sheriff Taylor didn't look entirely convinced. "Edison and his party are staying at the hotel. Want me to let them know you're in town to discuss terms?" "Please, and I'd like to speak with this Marshal Cooper about the Veterans Program, get a better sense of the men who might be coming to work the place." The sheriff nodded and rose. "I'll fetch them. You want coffee while you wait? Mrs. Taylor sent over a fresh pot this morning." Hank accepted the offer and soon found himself in conversation with Edison and Marshal Cooper, finalizing details for both the land purchase and the employment program. Two veterans, former cavalry soldiers with experience handling horses and livestock, would arrive by train within the month, assuming Hank found them suitable after interviews. "They're good men," Cooper assured him. "One's a farrier by training, which I understand is a valuable skill out here where blacksmiths are scarce. The other worked cattle in Texas before the war, both looking for fresh starts away from the memories back east." Hank could appreciate that motivation. Wasn't that what had driven him west as well? A desire to begin anew where the shadows of the past didn't linger on every street corner and in every familiar face. With the primary business concluded, Edison turned the conversation to his other proposal. "Have you had a chance to discuss the research hospital position with Miss Prescott? Dr. Simmons speaks very highly of her medical knowledge and innovative approaches." "We've discussed it briefly," Hank replied, choosing his words with care. "She seemed interested, though she has commitments in Whiteridge to consider." Edison nodded understandingly. "Of course, the position wouldn't be available until spring in any case. The facility is still being completed. But if she's interested, a letter of introduction from me would ensure her application receives proper consideration." "I'll let her know," Hank assured him, though the thought of Tessa leaving for Helena still created that hollow feeling in his chest. With the formal business concluded, Hank found himself with additional errands in town. The expansion of his ranch would require supplies and preparations beyond what he currently maintained. As he moved from the general store to the mercantile, he was struck by how differently the townspeople received him compared to his previous visits. Word of his confrontation with Chicago Consolidated had clearly spread, transforming him from the reclusive rancher to be pitied or gossiped about into someone worthy of respect and inclusion. Shopkeepers engaged him in conversation beyond mere transactions, and several ranchers stopped him to express solidarity against the cattle company's tactics. Most surprising was Mrs. Holloway at the general store, who refrained from her usual matchmaking attempts and instead treated him with a newfound respect. "Heard you're taking on the Henderson place," she remarked as she gathered his supplies. "Smart move. That spring on the south end never runs dry, even in August." "So I've heard," Hank replied, still slightly uncomfortable with the attention but making an effort to respond politely. "And taking on hands too, they say," she glanced at him shrewdly. "Time's changing for Hank Barstow, it seems." There was a question implicit in her statement that Hank chose not to address directly. "The ranch has grown beyond what one man can reasonably manage," he said instead, echoing his earlier explanation to Tessa. Mrs. Holloway smiled knowingly but didn't press further. "Well, change can be a good thing. Speaking of which, that young lady staying at your line cabin, Miss Prescott, she's been a godsend for this town. Patched up 3 miners last week when Doc Simmons was out delivering the Peterson baby. Got a real gift for healing, that one." Hank nodded, unsurprised by this assessment of Tessa's abilities. "She's a skilled medical professional. And not hard on the eyes either," Mrs. Holloway added with a meaningful glance. When Hank's expression remained neutral, she sighed dramatically. "Well, I suppose some men are slower to recognize what's right in front of them than others. Your order will be ready in 10 minutes, Mr. Barstow." As Hank waited, he found his thoughts returning to Tessa and the future that now seemed to be taking shape. His decision to expand the ranch had been practical on the surface, a good business opportunity that secured his position as one of the county's significant landowners. But beneath that practicality lay a deeper truth he was only beginning to acknowledge. He was making room in his life for something beyond mere survival. The question remained whether Tessa might consider being part of that future, or if her path would take her to Helena and the research position that aligned so perfectly with her medical ambitions. With his business in town concluded, Hank headed back to his ranch, his saddlebags full of supplies and his mind even more occupied than when he had left that morning. The winter day was already fading toward dusk as he approached his property, the setting sun casting long shadows across the snow-covered landscape. As he crested the final rise that overlooked his ranch, Hank paused, taking in the scene below. Smoke rose from both cabin chimneys, and he could see Tessa in the yard between them, splitting firewood with practiced efficiency despite her slight frame. The sight stirred something in him, a sense of rightness, of possibility, of a future he had never allowed himself to imagine. He urged Thunderhead forward, and Tessa looked up at the sound of hoofbeats, setting aside the axe as he approached. "Successful trip to town," she called, brushing wood chips from her heavy coat. Hank dismounted, nodding. "Very. I've accepted Edison's offer on the Henderson property and arranged for 2 hands to arrive next month through the Veterans Program." Surprise and what looked like pleasure crossed her face. "That's wonderful news. The combined properties will make an exceptional ranch." "That's the hope," he agreed, leading Thunderhead toward the stable. Tessa fell into step beside him, her cheeks flushed from exertion and the cold. "I should warn you," she said as they walked, "Dr. Simmons rode out while you were gone. He's been called to a difficult case in the mining camp 15 miles north and asked if I would cover his patients in town for the next few days." Hank nodded, understanding the implications. "You'll need to stay in town then." "Yes, beginning tomorrow morning. I've prepared everything you'll need for your wound care. It's healing well enough now that you can manage the dressing changes yourself." She hesitated slightly. "I should be back in 3 days, weather permitting." "I'll manage," Hank assured her, though the thought of returning to his solitary existence, even temporarily, no longer held the appeal it once had. "Did Dr. Simmons mention the research hospital in Helena?" Tessa glanced at him, her expression careful. "He did, yes. He thinks it would be an excellent opportunity for me to continue my studies under proper conditions." "And what do you think?" Hank couldn't quite keep the tension from his voice as he asked the question that had been weighing on him since Edison's visit. They had reached the stable, and Tessa waited as he unsaddled Thunderhead and began rubbing the horse down with a handful of straw. "I think," she said slowly, "that opportunities must be evaluated not just for what they offer but for what they might require us to sacrifice." It wasn't a direct answer, but Hank understood the complexity behind her response. The research position represented everything she had come west to find: professional respect, the chance to develop her medical knowledge, the opportunity to make a meaningful contribution to frontier healthcare. Yet it would also mean leaving Whiteridge, leaving the independence she had carved out for herself, leaving him. "Edison offered to write you a letter of introduction," he said, continuing his care of Thunderhead. "Said it would ensure your application receives proper consideration." Tessa was quiet for a moment, watching him work. "That's very kind of him, I'll consider it carefully." They finished settling Thunderhead for the night and walked toward the main cabin together, the early winter darkness already fallen around them. Inside, Tessa had prepared a simple stew that filled the cabin with savory aromas, reminding Hank again of how quickly he had grown accustomed to her presence in his daily life. As they ate, Hank described his meetings in town and the plans for integrating the Henderson property into his existing operation. Tessa listened with genuine interest, offering practical suggestions about housing for the ranch hands and the potential for expanding the garden come spring to accommodate additional mouths to feed. "You've thought about this before," Hank observed, noting the detail in her suggestions. She smiled slightly. "I grew up on a small farm outside Philadelphia before my father's medical practice became established. I still remember my mother's methods for feeding a household efficiently." A shadow crossed her face briefly. "She died when I was 16, typhoid." "I'm sorry," Hank said simply, understanding all too well the loss of a parent. Tessa nodded in acknowledgement. "It was a long time ago, but I still use many of her techniques for managing a household. They're practical regardless of the setting." The conversation flowed easily between them, touching on ranch management, local events, and plans for the coming spring. It struck Hank again how naturally they had fallen into this rhythm of shared meals and meaningful discussion, so different from the superficial interactions he usually endured when forced into social situations. As they finished the meal, a comfortable silence fell between them. Tessa rose to clear the dishes, and Hank found himself watching her movements around his kitchen, the grace with which she handled even simple tasks, the quiet competence that characterized everything she did. "I should prepare for tomorrow," she said finally, gathering her coat. "Dr. Simmons left quite a list of patients to check on." Hank nodded, rising to walk her to the door. "I'll bring your horse to town if the weather turns bad and you need to stay longer." "Thank you." She paused at the threshold, looking up at him with those clear green eyes that seemed to see far more than he sometimes wished to reveal. "Congratulations again on the Henderson property, Hank. I think you've made the right decision." Something in her tone, a gentle emphasis on the personal rather than the practical aspects of his choice, gave him courage. "Tessa," he said, his voice lower than he'd intended, "about the research hospital." She waited, her expression open but guarded, as if preparing herself for whatever he might say. "I wouldn't want to stand in the way of your ambitions," he continued carefully. "It's clearly an exceptional opportunity for someone with your skills." "But," she prompted softly when he hesitated. Hank took a deep breath, stepping into unfamiliar and frightening territory. "But I've grown accustomed to your presence here, more than accustomed, and the thought of returning to the way things were before you arrived isn't as appealing as it once would have been." It wasn't quite a declaration, but it was more than he had offered anyone in years, an acknowledgement of connection, of the space she had come to occupy in his life. Tessa studied his face for a long moment, as if weighing his words and the meaning behind them. "The research position doesn't begin until spring," she said finally. "There's time yet to consider all options." She hesitated, then added with quiet directness, "including whether there might be reasons to remain in Whiteridge that outweigh the professional opportunities in Helena." The statement hung between them, laden with possibilities neither was quite ready to fully articulate. Hank nodded, understanding the careful balance she was maintaining, neither promising to stay nor dismissing the significance of what had begun to develop between them. "Safe travels to town tomorrow," he said. "I'll check on the line cabin while you're gone." "Thank you," she smiled, a genuine expression that warmed her eyes. "Good night, Hank." "Good night, Tessa." As she walked through the snow toward her own cabin, Hank remained in the doorway, watching until she was safely inside. The night was clear and cold, stars emerging in brilliant profusion across the vast Montana sky. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to look at that sky and see not just isolation and survival, but possibility and future. Whether Tessa would be part of that future remained uncertain, but he had taken the first step toward making room for something beyond his carefully constructed solitude. And that in itself was a kind of victory over the fears that had shaped his life for so long. The next 3 days passed slowly for Hank. With Tessa in town attending to Dr. Simmons's patients, he threw himself into preparations for the ranch expansion, clearing additional corrals, assessing the existing structures on the Henderson property, and planning improvements for the spring. The work was physically demanding, especially as his wounded side continued to heal, but it kept his mind occupied and prevented him from dwelling too much on Tessa's absence. Each evening, however, as he returned to his solitary cabin, he found himself acutely aware of the silence that had once been his preferred state, but now felt somehow lacking. On the afternoon of the third day, as Hank was repairing a section of fence along his northern boundary, he spotted a rider approaching from the direction of town. Even at a distance, he recognized Tessa's straight-backed posture and the chestnut hair escaping from beneath her hat. Something lightened in his chest at the sight, a tension he hadn't fully acknowledged releasing its grip. He raised a hand in greeting as she drew closer, noting the weariness in her face despite her smile. "Busy few days?" he asked as she reined in beside him. "Very," she confirmed, dismounting with less than her usual grace. 3 broken bones, a birth, numerous winter ailments, and one mining accident that required significant surgical intervention. Despite the exhaustion evident in her voice, there was also satisfaction, the pleasure of meaningful work competently performed. "Dr. Simmons is fortunate to have your assistance," Hank observed, gathering his tools, "as are his patients." "Thank you," she glanced at the repaired fence line. "You've been busy yourself, I see." Hank nodded, securing the last wire in place. "Preparing for spring. With the Henderson property integrated, there's much to be done before calving season." They walked together toward the ranch buildings, leading their horses through the ankle-deep snow. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the white landscape, the air growing colder as evening approached. "Any word from Dr. Simmons about his return?" Hank asked as they neared the stables. "He sent a message this morning. The case is stabilized and he expects to be back by tomorrow afternoon." Tessa removed her gloves as they entered the relative warmth of the stable. "I've left everything organized for his return." Hank nodded, unsaddling his horse with practiced efficiency. "And the research hospital, did you have a chance to consider Edison's offer of introduction?" Tessa was quiet for a moment as she tended to her own mount. "I did," she said finally. "I wrote to the director requesting more information about the position and their research focus." It was a measured response, neither acceptance nor rejection, but Hank felt a small twinge of disappointment nonetheless. He had known, of course, that the opportunity aligned perfectly with her medical ambitions. It would be selfish to hope she might decline it, especially when he had offered no clear alternative. "A sensible approach," he said, keeping his tone neutral. "Information is never wasted, even if you ultimately decide against the position." Tessa glanced at him, her green eyes searching his face. "Yes, exactly. Though such decisions rarely come down to information alone." There was a question implicit in her statement, one Hank wasn't yet prepared to answer fully. Instead, he changed the subject slightly. "I received word from Marshal Cooper yesterday. The 2 veterans I mentioned will arrive by train next Tuesday. I'll need to prepare the old bunkhouse on the Henderson property for them." "So soon?" Tessa looked surprised. "That hardly leaves time for proper preparations. Apparently one was already in Bozeman visiting family and can travel immediately. The other will join from Denver." Hank led the way out of the stable toward the main cabin. "The timing is actually convenient. They can help with the remaining winter tasks and be fully integrated before the spring rush." As they entered the cabin, the chill of the late afternoon gave way to the welcoming warmth of the fire Hank had banked before leaving that morning. Tessa removed her coat with a sigh of appreciation, the tension in her shoulders visibly easing in the cabin's comfort. "You should rest," Hank told her, noticing the shadows beneath her eyes. "I can prepare supper this evening." She looked about to protest, then seemed to reconsider. "Thank you, I am rather exhausted. 3 days with minimal sleep takes a toll, even when the work is satisfying." While Tessa settled in the chair by the fire, Hank busied himself preparing a simple meal of beans, salt pork, and the last of the biscuits she had made before leaving for town. His cooking skills were functional rather than refined, but years of bachelor living had taught him to manage the basics adequately. As he worked, he found himself reflecting on the domesticity of the scene, Tessa resting by his fire, himself preparing a meal for them both, the comfortable silence broken only by the crackling of the flames and the occasional clink of cookware. It felt right in a way he hadn't expected, this shared space and purpose. When the meal was ready, they ate together, Tessa describing some of the more interesting cases she had treated during her time in town. Hank listened with genuine interest, asking questions about treatments and outcomes that revealed his respect for her medical knowledge. "Dr. Simmons has asked me to continue assisting him regularly," she mentioned as they finished eating. 2 days a week plus emergencies. He says his practice has grown beyond what one doctor can reasonably manage since the railroad's arrival. "Will you accept?" Hank asked, curious about her plans now that the possibility of the Helena position had entered the equation. "I'm inclined to, yes," she met his gaze directly, "at least until spring when other decisions might need to be made." The implication was clear. Spring would bring not only the Helena opportunity, but also the end of her lease on the line cabin. Hank nodded, acknowledging the timeline without pressing for commitments neither of them was ready to make. As they cleared away the dishes together, moving in easy synchronization around the small kitchen space, Hank found himself wondering what it would be like to have this not just for a few months but permanently, this partnership of equals, this shared life built on mutual respect and complementary strengths. The thought should have terrified him, given his long-held convictions about independence and emotional self-protection, yet somehow it didn't. Instead, it felt like the natural evolution of something that had been building since that first snowy confrontation with Chicago Consolidated's men, a recognition that facing life's challenges together might offer advantages that outweighed the risks of vulnerability. Later, as Tessa prepared to return to the line cabin for the night, Hank found himself reluctant to see her go. The 3 days of her absence had clarified something he had been unwilling to fully acknowledge before. His solitude, once cherished, now felt incomplete without her presence. "Tessa," he said as she gathered her coat and gloves, "I've been thinking about the Henderson property." She looked up inquiringly. "Yes." "The main house is larger than my cabin, built for a family rather than a single man. Once the hands arrive, I'll be relocating there to better oversee both properties." He hesitated, then pressed on. "The house has separate quarters that were originally intended for a housekeeper or elderly relative. They would make an excellent medical office with appropriate modifications." Tessa went very still, her eyes searching his face. "Are you suggesting that the arrangement we currently have with the line cabin could continue, but with improved facilities?" Hank clarified, careful not to presume too much. "The local ranchers and mining camps would benefit from regular medical services closer than town. And with the expansion of my operation, there will inevitably be injuries and ailments requiring treatment." It wasn't quite the personal declaration that part of him wanted to make, but it acknowledged the value of her presence and offered a practical alternative to the Helena position, one that would allow her to continue her medical work while remaining in Whiteridge. "That's a generous offer," Tessa said slowly, her expression thoughtful, "and a sensible arrangement from a practical standpoint." "But," Hank prompted, sensing her hesitation. She met his gaze directly, her green eyes clear and unwavering. "But I would need to understand what such an arrangement would mean, beyond the practical considerations, what kind of future you envision for yourself and others who might be part of it." The question cut straight to the heart of the matter, challenging Hank to articulate what he had only begun to acknowledge to himself. It was a fair question, one that deserved an honest answer, however difficult that might be for a man unaccustomed to discussing his feelings. "I've lived alone for a long time," he began carefully, "convinced myself it was safer that way. No attachments meant no vulnerabilities, no risk of the kind of devastation I saw destroy my mother." He took a deep breath, forcing himself to continue despite the discomfort of such openness. "But these past weeks have shown me there might be another way to live, one that allows for connection without complete surrender of independence. A partnership rather than a merger." Tessa's expression softened slightly, encouraging him to continue. "I can't promise I'll transform overnight into a social man," he admitted. "The habits of years don't disappear so easily, but I know now that I don't want to return to complete isolation. And I know that your presence here, your competence, your intelligence, your independence has become important to me." It wasn't a traditional declaration of love, but it was honest. And for Hank Barstow, it represented a monumental shift from the philosophy that had guided his life for over a decade. "Thank you for your honesty," Tessa said softly. "It can't have been easy for you." Hank shrugged slightly, uncomfortable with the emotional weight of the moment, yet relieved to have spoken his truth. "Your turn," he said simply. A small smile touched her lips. "Yes, I suppose it is." She gathered her thoughts for a moment before continuing. "The research hospital in Helena represents everything I thought I wanted when I came west: professional recognition, the chance to advance medical knowledge, a community of like-minded practitioners." Hank nodded, bracing himself for what seemed like the prelude to a gentle rejection. "But these past weeks have shown me something I hadn't considered," she continued. "That there might be value in building something from the ground up, in serving a community that truly needs the skills I can offer, rather than adding my voice to an established chorus." Hope flickered in Hank's chest, though he kept his expression carefully neutral. "And," he prompted, and Tessa met his gaze directly, "I've discovered that independence doesn't necessarily mean isolation. That there might be strength in selective connection, properly founded on mutual respect and complementary purposes." It was, in its way, as careful and measured a response as his own had been, acknowledging the significance of what had developed between them without rushing headlong into declarations neither was quite ready to make. "So," Hank said after a moment, "you'll consider the medical office at the Henderson house." "I will," she confirmed with a small smile, "though I should visit the property first to assess its suitability." Of course, relief and something warmer coursed through him. "Perhaps tomorrow if weather permits." Tomorrow would be perfect. Tessa donned her coat and gloves, preparing to face the cold walk to the line cabin. "Thank you, Hank. For your honesty, and for seeing possibilities I didn't think existed when I first came west." As she stepped out into the clear, cold night, Hank watched her go with a lightness in his chest that had been absent for longer than he could remember. Nothing was settled, there were still decisions to be made, adjustments to navigate, futures to determine. But for the first time in years, he found himself looking forward to those futures rather than simply enduring the present. The frontier was still harsh, the challenges of ranching life still daunting. But they no longer seemed like burdens to be borne in solitude. Instead, they had become opportunities to build something lasting, something that might, with care and courage, extend beyond mere survival to encompass partnership, purpose, and perhaps even love. The following day dawned clear and cold, perfect conditions for visiting the Henderson property. After completing essential morning chores, Hank and Tessa rode out together, following the fence line that currently separated the two ranches but would soon be removed to create a single, expanded operation. Henderson had good instincts for land, Hank observed as they crested a rise that overlooked the southern property. The placement of the buildings takes advantage of natural windbreaks, and the proximity to the year-round spring is ideal. Below them, the Henderson homestead stood in silent dignity, a substantial two-story house built of squared logs with a generous porch wrapping around three sides, a large barn, several outbuildings, and the bunkhouse where Hank's new ranch hands would soon be housed. Though showing signs of the previous year's neglect, the structures remained fundamentally sound, a testament to Henderson's craftsmanship. "It's beautiful," Tessa said softly, taking in the pastoral scene. "Why would anyone leave such a place willingly?" "They didn't," Hank replied grimly. "Chicago Consolidated forced them out. Intimidation, threats, cut fences. Henderson held out as long as he could, but with a sick wife and no help. He finally sold for pennies on the dollar just to get her to safety." He turned to look at the house again, his expression hardening. "That's why Edison's offer matters. It's a chance to set things right. To make this land productive again, the way Henderson intended." Tessa walked up the steps to the wide porch, her boots echoing on the sturdy wood. She peered through a window into the dusty interior. "The structure is sound," she noted, "and you're right about the layout. The side wing has a separate entrance. It would make an excellent clinic, accessible to patients without disturbing the main household." She turned back to face him, leaning against the porch railing. "It's a bold plan, Hank. Combining the properties, hiring veterans, establishing a medical outpost. It transforms you from a solitary rancher into a community leader." "I'm not looking to lead anyone," he grumbled, though the protest lacked heat. "Just looking to build something that lasts." "And to share it," she added softly. Hank walked up the steps to stand beside her. The The proximity was electric, charged with all the unspoken possibilities that had been gathering between them like storm clouds. Yes, he admitted, his voice rough, to share it. He looked out over the valley, then back at her. Ideally with someone who understands the land, someone who isn't afraid of hard work or long winters. Someone who, he hesitated, his courage faltering for a moment before he pushed through. Someone who needs a place to build her own legacy as much as I need to share mine. Tessa's eyes searched his, shimmering with suppressed emotion. That sounds like a very specific set of qualifications, Mr. Barstow. It is, he agreed. There's only one applicant I'm interested in. He reached out, taking her gloved hand in his. Stay, Tessa, not just for the winter. Not just for the clinic, stay for the life we could build here. Tessa looked down at their joined hands, then up at the snow-capped mountain standing sentinel over the valley. She thought of the research hospital, clean, sterile, prestigious. Then she thought of the past weeks, the shared meals, the quiet evenings by the fire, the feeling of purpose and belonging she had found in this rugged, beautiful place. The research is important, she said slowly. But you were right, Hank. Isolation has its limits, and so does professional ambition if it means leaving behind the place where your heart has finally found a home. She squeezed his hand. I'll write to the director in Helena today. To decline the position. Hank felt a weight lift from his soul that he hadn't fully realized he was carrying. You're sure? I've never been more sure of anything, she promised. The spring thaw arrived in a rush of mud and green shoots, transforming the Whiteridge Valley from a monochrome winter landscape into a riot of color. The creek swelled with snowmelt, the willows along its banks turning gold and green, while the pastures erupted in wildflowers. Activity at the newly expanded Barstow Ranch matched the frenetic pace of nature. The two veterans arrived on schedule, Thomas and Elias, and proved to be exactly as Marshall Cooper had promised. Hard-working, disciplined men grateful for the chance to build a new life. They took to the work with enthusiasm, helping Hank repair the Henderson buildings and prepare for the spring calving season. Tessa moved her practice into the renovated wing of the main house in April. News of the ranch clinic spread quickly, and soon ranchers from across the southern county were bringing their ailments and injuries to her, grateful to avoid the long trek into town. She managed the practice with her usual efficiency, while also taking charge of the household garden and domestic management, a partnership of labor that felt seamless and right. Despite their shared living arrangements and deepened commitment, they maintained a careful propriety. The veterans bunked in the rehabilitated bunkhouse, while Hank continued to sleep in his original cabin, leaving the main house to Tessa until things were formalized. That formality came on a Sunday in late May, when the air was sweet with sage and the sky a perfect, cloudless blue. Hank found Tessa in the garden she had coaxed back to life, her hands deep in the soil as she planted medicinal herbs alongside the vegetables. She looked up as he approached, wiping a smudge of dirt from her cheek with the back of her hand, a gesture that endeared her to him more than any polished elegance ever could. The comfrey is taking root well, she reported with satisfaction. And the calendula should bloom by July. Hank knelt beside her, ignoring the dirt on his knees. Tessa. Something in his tone made her pause, her trowel stilling in the earth. She turned to face him fully. We've built a good life here these past months, he said, a strong partnership. We have, she agreed softly, but partnership isn't enough for me anymore. He took her dirty hands in his own calloused ones, heedless of the soil. I don't just want a business partner or a tenant or even a friend. I want the woman who rode into a blizzard to save my cattle, the woman who stitched me up and challenged my solitude, the woman who makes this place home. He didn't have a ring, jewelry stores were scarce in the territory, but he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object. It was a locket, old gold worn smooth by time. This was my mother's, he said, his voice thick with emotion. It's the only thing of hers I have left. She kept my father's picture in it until the day she died. He opened it to show the empty frames. It's been empty for 12 years. Waiting for a new story. He placed it in her palm. Tessa Prescott, will you marry me? Will you fill this locket and this house in my life? Tessa looked at the locket, then at him, tears standing in her eyes. She didn't wipe them away. I told you once that I came west to be free, she whispered. I didn't know then that freedom isn't about being alone. It's about choosing who you belong to. She closed her fingers over the locket, holding it to her heart. Yes, Hank, I will marry you. I will be your wife, your partner, your love, for every winter and every summer to come. Hank pulled her into his arms, kissing her amidst the scent of warming earth and new growth, sealing a promise that had begun in the bitter cold of winter and bloomed, against all odds, into a spring that would last a lifetime. The Barstow Ranch had become a landmark in the territory, not just for the quality of its cattle, but as a model of what a working ranch could be. The veterans program had expanded, with 4 men now working the land, several having brought families of their own to settle in cabins built on the property. But the heart of the ranch remained the big house on the hill. Hank stood on the porch watching the sunset paint the Bitterroot Mountains in shades of violet and fire. He was tired, it had been a long day of branding, but it was a good tiredness, the satisfaction of work well done. Papa. A squealing bundle of energy launched itself at his legs. Hank reached down and scooped up his 4-year-old son, William, swinging him high into the air. "Careful with him, Hank," Tessa called from the doorway, though her smile belied her warning. She stepped out onto the porch, carrying their infant daughter, Sarah, in her arms. Hank settled William on his hip and turned to his wife. She was as beautiful as the day he'd met her in the general store, though her face now bore the fine lines of laughter and living in the sun. She wore the gold locket around her neck, warm against her skin. "Clinic busy today?" he asked, kissing her temple. "2 sprained ankles and a colicky baby," she reported. "Nothing we couldn't handle." She looked out over the valley, where the lights of the bunkhouse and the neighboring cabins were beginning to twinkle in the twilight. "It's grown so much." "It has," Hank agreed. He thought back to the man he had been 5 years ago, solitary, frozen, convinced that he needed nothing and no one. He looked at the thriving ranch, the community they had fostered, and the family held safe in his arms. "You asked me once," he murmured, "if I wanted a wife or just a winter alone." Tessa looked up at him, her eyes dancing with the memory. "I believe I was rather impertinent." "You were perfect," he corrected. "And I was a fool to think winter was something to be endured alone." He wrapped his free arm around her and their daughter, pulling them close as the last light faded from the sky. The wind still blew down from the mountains, cold and wild, but it didn't matter anymore. The fire was lit, the house was full, and Hank Barstow, the man who had wanted nothing but solitude, had found everything in the warmth of the life they had built together. He was never going to be alone again.